Today's hearing on collusion in the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama to lead us all in the Pledge of Allegiance. Chair is now recognized for an opening statement. Section 1 of the Sherman Act makes anti-competitive restraints of trade illegal. This includes coordinated actions that harm consumers by limiting the choices available to Americans. That is exactly what the World Federation of Advertisers, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, and every company that is a member of these organizations has done over the last 5 years. They came together, agreed to limit advertising on certain platforms and news outlets that millions of Americans choose to read, watch, and listen to. And how do they do this? WFA members represent roughly 90% of the global advertising spend. That means WFA has almost complete monopoly power over advertising dollars and a tremendous amount of market power. GARM, which is an initiative of the WFA, includes in its membership over 100 of the world's biggest brands, ad tech providers, and advertising agencies. GARM has representatives from each of the 6 major advertising agency holding companies. GARM's steer team, which acts as a board of directors for the organization and approves nearly every action by the alliance, includes Unilever and other massive consumer goods companies, as well as GroupM, the world's largest media buying agency. They collude to make sure that no other advertisers support any news outlets, platforms, or creators that these massive companies don't agree with. And these people do not like conservatives. Again, don't take my word for it. Here's what employees at GroupM said to GARM's leader about Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Breitbart News. Employees from GroupM said, quote, they hated their ideology. That employee was discussing how to pull advertising from these news outlets. And unfortunately, it's not just GroupM. Unilever encouraged Facebook to label one of President Trump's political ads as misinformation during the 2020 election, which would have caused that ad to be removed from Facebook. GARM organized a boycott of Twitter when Mr. Musk bought the platform and bragged about cutting Twitter, and then they bragged about cutting Twitter's revenue by 80%. Unilever wrote to GARM's leader that the company had, quote, issues with overtly partisan takes by Elon Musk. The example Unilever gave was Elon Musk's handling of the Hunter Biden laptop story. Unilever had a problem with Elon Musk releasing internal Twitter documents to journalists and exposing how and why Twitter incorrectly suppressed the story about the Biden's family influence peddling. It's the Twitter files. GARM and its members threaten platforms that don't comply, and the best example is Spotify's Joe Rogan's comments on Spotify when Joe Rogan's comments about the COVID-19 vaccine. To be clear, any of these companies could, on their own, legally refuse to advertise on a certain platform or news outlet or with a certain content creator. Unilateral decisions are not illegal. But if they choose to pull advertising from the Daily Wire or other similar outlets, they will not be reaching millions of Americans who choose to consume that content, but their competitors will. In other words, no single company can unilaterally pull its advertising dollars off a platform or news outlet over a long period of time because that company's competitors will advertise and reach the audience. It's called the market. Ørsted, a Danish renewable energy company, explained it perfectly when its employees wrote an email to GARM asking when the Twitter boycott will end. Ørsted told GARM that Twitter, quote, is an important platform for us to reach our audience, so we would like to consider going back. But they looked to GARM for direction, and they were asking GARM for permission. And frankly, that's exactly how cartels operate. They collude against conservatives and other outlets, platforms, and content creators. In fact, they come right out and say it. GARM's leader wrote that the issue with the advertising industry and digital platforms is the, quote, extreme global interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. He also complained taking U.S. norms and applying them globally is something that's a concern and said there's a problem with Americans' 230-year-old Constitution. If the WFA and GARM are allowed to continue. If these massive companies can collude without consequences, the results will be devastating. If this cartel continues to target conservative outlets, content creators with different voices and viewpoints, and any person that does not recite the so-called mainstream media talking points, there'll be real problems. They will deprive these good journalists and content creators of the funding they need to succeed. They will use their cartel to eliminate competition based on internal biases of these massive companies, and they will deprive Americans of the content that they actually want to consume. With that, I would yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, this hearing has nothing to do with antitrust laws, since the majority's allegations wither under even the most basic antitrust analysis. This is instead another dangerous effort by the majority to bully companies into promoting and supporting far-right extremist views, views that brands understandably do not want to be associated with. In this case, the majority seeks to undermine companies' First Amendment rights and to make it harder for them to avoid monetizing online and offline harm through advertising. This includes harm like the creation and distribution of exploitative images and videos of children, the promotion of terrorism and funding of terrorist organizations, the promotion and distribution of foreign propaganda materials, and the promotion and distribution of racist, hateful, and discriminatory content. Under the majority's theory of supposed antitrust harm, advertisers who do not want their expensive ad campaigns placed next to hate speech, pirated copyrighted material, foreign propaganda, and other harmful content are, quote, colluding to demonetize so-called conservative content. Under the majority's theory, the only way to cure this alleged harm would be for advertisers to be forced to run ads on platforms like Twitter, now known as X, Truth Social, Breitbart, and the Daily Wire, even though those sites are rife with adult content, hate speech, false information, misinformation, and racist and violent propaganda. Further undermining this claim of harm, the so-called victims of this made-up scheme are well supported by ad revenue, subscriber revenue, and sales revenue. Take the Daily Wire, the media outlet run by Republican witness Ben Shapiro. Its website generated $220 million last year. His show is the 13th most popular podcast in the first quarter of 2024. His website has over 15 million followers across his main social media handles, including on sites that are members of the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, known as GARM, the target of today's hearing. And the Daily Wire, quote, received more likes, shares, and comments on Facebook, unquote, which we should note is a member of GARM, than any other news publisher by a wide margin in 2021. And even the video in which Mr. Shapiro claims to be the victim of global advertising organizations was itself supported by advertising revenue and is available on YouTube, a member of GARM. This hardly sounds like the victim of a conspiracy to suppress content. But Mr. Shapiro's content is not alone. Many so-called conservative brands have made notable gains in corporate reputation among consumers, and several brands that call themselves anti-woke have entered the market to cater to customers who wish to vote with their wallet. Advertisers have the right to target their ads to the platforms, websites, and venues they choose. By forcing advertisers to run ads on websites that they deem to contain harmful information and content, the majority would be undermining those companies' right to free speech under the First Amendment. It's also an essential tenet of a free market that companies are not forced to do business with anyone. And indeed, a competitive online environment is necessary for advertisers to easily choose where and how their ads are rolled out. Historically, this committee has worked hard to protect consumers, ensure a free and fair market, and push back on corporate abuse, greed, and malfeasance. We advanced bipartisan bills to combat market concentration, from online platforms to drug pricing. We did all this because we took our job seriously, to protect competition in the marketplace. We understood the unique importance of the federal antitrust laws, not as a weapon to use against our political opponents, but as an essential component of the American social contract. Unfortunately, this majority has picked a different direction. Under the direction of the chair, the committee is abusing its oversight authority. The Republicans are so committed to the belief that conservative content, in quotes, is being censored, despite all evidence to the contrary, that they will do anything to undermine the efforts of platforms to moderate their own content, which the Supreme Court recently affirmed is an exercise of their First Amendment rights, governments to communicate with platforms about security threats, online and offline crime and terrorism, and mis- and disinformation that threatens our nation's health and democracy, and companies to choose where and how to advertise their products. This hearing is the result of a 15-month investigation that has resulted in over 37 productions to the committee of more than 175,000 pages and one transcribed interview. I can only assume that the reason the majority has not asked GARM, the main target of this investigation, to send a witness here today is that the majority knows there is no evidence to support their claim of wrongdoing. Their investigation was not designed to uncover unlawful behavior because they knew there was none. Instead, it was designed to chill companies' exercise of their First Amendment rights. It was designed to make companies afraid to speak to each other about the real connection between the online monetization of criminal and harmful content and the funding of offline harm. Make no mistake, the companies represented here today and the others that are part of GARM want, first and foremost, for customers to see their ads where and when they expect them and to make purchases based on those ads. But secondly and importantly, they do not want their expensive ad campaigns to fund people, one, who pirate content, two, who promote and execute terrorist acts, three, who make and distribute harmful and exploitive images of children, and four, others who use the internet to distribute and fund crime. Republicans are so determined to prove their conspiracy theory that conservative content is being censored that they will do anything, including launching a fruitless and harmful investigation to bully companies that do not hold their views. I hope that we will get back to doing the serious work of the American people very soon and not continue to waste taxpayer dollars on fishing expeditions designed to help hate and criminal activity spread on and offline. I thank the witnesses for appearing today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back without objection. All of their opening statements will be included in the record. We now introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Christian Jewell is the global CEO of GroupM, one of the world's largest media buying agencies with more than $60 billion in annual media spending. GroupM's agencies and subdivisions include Mindshare, Wavemaker, Essence, Mediacom, TNPM, and others. Mr. Harish Patel is the president of Unilever USA and CEO of Unilever's Personal Care North America division. As CEO of Personal Care North America, Mr. Patel oversees brands including Dove, Degree, and Axe, among others. Mr. Benjamin Shapiro is the host of The Ben Shapiro Show, a daily political podcast and radio show. He's also the editor emeritus of The Daily Wire, which he co-founded. In 2015, Mr. Shapiro has written a number of books on current events, routinely speaks at conferences, colleges, and universities, and if you can believe what the ranking members said, has a website that generates $220 million a year, 13th most popular podcast, and 15 million followers. Imagine what he can do if GARM wasn't targeting the Daily Wire. And finally, we have Mr. Spencer Waller, is the Justice John Paul Stevens Chair in Competition Law and Professor and Director of the Institute for Consumer Antitrust Studies at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law. Professor Waller's courses and research focus on antitrust, class actions, innovation, and intellectual property. Welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Mr. Jewell, we will begin with you.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Christian Jewell. I'm the Global Chief Executive Officer of GroupM, the media investment company. In simple terms, we buy ad space across channels, including television, digital, and print, for our clients and place ads within that space. Brands tell us the message they want to share and the audience they want to target. We then advertise on which media environments would be best suited for the product and buy ad space on those channels on the brand's behalf. Collectively, brands invest billions of dollars in advertising annually to shape how they are perceived. One of the marketers' biggest fears is that years of brand value could evaporate overnight as a consequence of bad ad placement. Companies spending millions of advertising dollars do not want to risk their brand on a strategy that could backfire. Brands consistently inform us as their agency that they do not want to advertise next to hot button or divisive content. They want predictable, reliable environments. In 2017, news outlets reported that major brands were unwittingly advertising next to ISIS propaganda. Unsurprisingly, they faced significant consumer pushback. Brands also had to contend with reports of Russian troll farms infiltrating platforms to disrupt presidential elections. And most recently, brands had to develop advertising strategies in the context of a pandemic that divided Americans. This resulted in a growing emphasis on brand suitability, or marketers' desire to protect their brand's value by ensuring their ads are not placed adjacent to content that could negatively affect their reputation. Brand suitability is particular to each brand. What is unsuitable to one may be perfectly suitable to another. But all brands generally agree they do not want to appear next to illegal or harmful content. Many also seek to avoid ad placements near content that, while not illegal, does not align with their values. With the increasing focus on brand suitability, brands wanted to better understand how publishers were identifying, prohibiting, and removing harmful content. What they found was that every platform took a different approach. Definitions of harmful content also varied. Without consistent standards, companies were concerned their ads would end up appearing in unsuitable environments. We believed that consistent standards were needed to help our clients connect with consumers, which is why we and other organizations came together to establish the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, or GARM. GARM developed standard definitions of content that brands might consider unsuitable so that advertisers and publishers could speak a common language about sensitive content. Adoption of GARM's definitions is, and always has been, completely voluntary. For GroupM's part, we follow our clients' ad placement wishes according to their risk tolerances and priorities. These priorities can shift quickly. It's our job to execute their strategy with speed and precision. We leverage GARM's definitions to provide our clients with a consistent, reliable framework. GroupM is not the arbiter of how to categorize websites, nor do we want to be. Because we have no control over publishers and no role in moderating content, we also rely on independent third parties to identify domains with those definitions and additional categories that our clients deem unsuitable. Among other things, those third parties consider media platforms' fact-checking resources, processes, and technologies when they evaluate the risks of placing content. That third-party assessment informs where we will place ads, including the sites to which we will not place ads without specific client request. Of note, approximately 94% of those websites are prescribed because they infringe on IP rights. This committee expressed an interest in advertising on certain news platforms. We appreciate the importance of funding news organizations through advertising, which is why we have taken steps to make advertising in news, including local news, more appealing to advertisers. Today, however, trust in news sites is at a low point, and brands generally disfavor advertising next to news. For example, only 1.28% of brand spend is allocated to online news at this point. This is because brands prefer to avoid advertising alongside common news content, war, scandal, political division, and also because they do not need to advertise there to reach their target audience. Alternatives such as sports and entertainment provide a better way to reach these same consumers. This is not a left, right, or GroupM preference. It is apolitical, it's an industry-wide preference. GroupM has no interest in impinging on anyone's right to speak or publish their points of view. We also believe companies have the right to choose where they place their advertisements. We all know how one bad ad placement can damage a company's reputation and bottom line, which is why brands and the companies like GroupM that serve them need tools and transparency to mitigate these risks. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jewell. Mr. Patel, you're recognized. Make sure that mic's on and pull it real close. Maybe not. We can get someone to help you there if it's okay. Thank you.
Chairman Jordan,
There you go.
Ranking Member Nedler, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss Unilever's approach to purchasing advertising that promotes over 400 different brands used by more than 3 billion people every day in more than 190 countries around the world. Unilever takes great care to ensure that our advertisements reach the consumers who use our products, promote our products and brands, and serve our business goals of offering consumers the brands they know and the trust their needs every day. In making decisions on advertising, Unilever uses its advertising dollars to reach as many consumers as we can in an environment that maximizes sales for our products. Currently, around 80% of our US advertising spend is directed in some form of digital media. We spend the most on digital commerce platforms like Amazon, Walmart, Target, and Walgreens, because that's where consumers are making their buying decisions. Only 20% of Unilever's advertising spending goes to social media platforms, and less than 1% goes to digital news. We want to reach all our consumers who use our brands on platforms that support and align with our brands. Conversely, being associated with content or a platform that detracts from our brands, harms our brands, or is inconsistent with our brands is decidedly not in our economic interest. With the rise of user-generated social media content and other online media, we have unfortunately seen repeated incidents where our brands have been associated with content that is harmful to our brands. One earlier example, ads from our Dove soap were appearing adjacent to content glorifying domestic violence and rape. In 2020, we suspended social media advertising when it became clear that the polarizing content would not serve the brands or add value to the brand places in the market. I want to be very clear on one crucially important fact. Unilever, and Unilever alone, controls our advertising spending. No platform has the right to our advertising dollars. As we look across the available advertising inventory, recognizing we do not have unlimited money to spend on advertising, we choose the channels, the platforms, and the outlets that give us the greatest commercial benefit for our advertising investment. We have internal policies and guides on our decisions. Our policies require our advertisement to be truthful, accurate, and transparent. In 2018, we adopted a responsible framework specifically for digital advertising, focusing on advertising towards responsible platforms, responsible content, and responsible infrastructure. We have a dedicated team of professionals who are constantly examining the advertising marketplace, working with platforms, selecting the platforms that meet our business needs. We also worked with the industry, including the Global Alliance of Responsible Media. GARM arose after leading advertisers observed that ads for their brand name products were appearing alongside despicable content. GARM's brand safety flaw and suitability framework are tools to help platforms communicate clearly about the content they will monetize and to assist advertisers and agencies in making decisions about advertising inventory and they will purchase. Although we've made good progress in ensuring that our digital advertising spend is advancing our brand's business objectives, there is still more work to be done. As recently as 2 years ago, Unilever received notice that certain ads from brands had been unknowingly placed adjacent to social media profiles involved in selling and soliciting child sexual abuse material. This is wholly unacceptable. We must do everything in our power as both advertisers and platforms that ensures our advertising dollars are serving the intended purpose of reaching consumers and promoting our brands, not funding hate and harm. And I would be happy to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. Mr. Shapiro, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, members of the committee, good morning.
Can't hear you.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, members of the committee, good morning. First of all, Ranking Member Nadler, I appreciate the kind words about our business. It's very kind of you. And also, I assume that we'd be doing a lot better without the institutional obstacles that I'm about to discuss. We're in the midst of a trust crisis in the world of media, which is because so many in the legacy media have lied in order to preserve left-leaning narratives. To take just the most recent example, we were told by the legacy media that President Biden was just fine. For years, anyone who questioned his health and mental fitness was trafficking in cheap fakes. And then President Biden went out and engaged in a full-scale mental collapse on stage in front of hundreds of millions of people. So we can see why Americans, at least Americans who are not Democrats, do not trust the media. The question isn't really why the legacy media have lost Americans' trust. We know that answer. The question is why, despite that loss of trust, the legacy media continue to gain share in the advertising market. And the answer is simple. There is, in fact, an informal pressure system created by Democratic legislators, this White House, legacy media, advertisers, and pseudo-objective brand safety organizations. That system guarantees that advertising dollars flow only to left-wing media brands. Let me explain how this works. When a conservative competitor to the legacy media arises, members of that legacy media and their political allies rush to paint such competitors as dangerous. The commentator Kara Swisher of the New York Times, for example, told the head of YouTube that my videos at Daily Wire were a, quote, gateway drug that would lead children, including her own teenage son, to watch neo-Nazi content. Never mind the yarmulke. Elected Democrats pick up that same messaging. In 2017, Senator Dianne Feinstein told lawyers at Facebook, Google, and Twitter, quote, "You created these platforms and now they're being misused, and you have to be the ones to do something about it or we will." Social media companies react to incentive structures, including threats. They've responded by adopting the standards of third-party left-wing informational safety groups like the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, or GARM. GARM purportedly sets brand safety standards, objective standards by which advertisers and platforms can supposedly determine just what sort of content ought to be deemed safe for advertising. In reality, GARM acts as a cartel. Its members account for 90% of ad spending in the United States, almost $1 trillion. In other words, if you're not getting ad dollars from GARM members, it's nearly impossible to run an ad-based business. And if you're not following their preferred political narratives, the ones that Kara Swisher and Dianne Feinstein would follow, you will not be deemed brand safe. Your business will be throttled. We at Daily Wire have experienced this firsthand. In 2017, after Senator Feinstein made her threats to bring the weight of government down on social media platforms, Daily Wire YouTube channel saw a 1,000% increase in content enforcements over a 2-year period. Since 2021, after Democrat officials further turned up the heat on social media companies, my personal Facebook page has seen an over 80% drop in impressions. Or take Joe Rogan. When Joe said that he had taken ivermectin after getting COVID, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki pressured Spotify to take action, stating, quote, "We want every platform to be doing more to call out mis- and disinformation while also uplifting accurate information." Spotify complied. Spotify, of course, works with GARM. So, what are the brand safety standards that GARM uses? The standards begin with inarguable things that we've heard from the other witnesses, like preventing distribution of child sexual abuse material or stopping terrorism. But GARM doesn't draw the line at what is criminal, abusive, or dangerous. Their standards also include restrictions on hate speech, harassment, misinformation, or my personal favorite, insensitive, irresponsible, and harmful treatment of debated sensitive social issues. Those criteria are highly subjective in theory, and they are purely partisan in practice. For example, last year, Daily Wire host Matt Walsh was fully demonetized on YouTube, a GARM member. Why? For quote-unquote misgendering, which to GARM is to say that men are not women. Perfectly obvious facts now run afoul of GARM's censorship standards. Companies targeted by GARM, like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, Fox News, and so many others, reach hundreds of millions of people with opinions and beliefs long established as within the mainstream of American conservative thought. GARM and its members have no respect for the beliefs of those people. They would like them marginalized or squashed. It's time to stand up for the First Amendment in this Congress. Congress can do so in 2 ways. First, Congress must investigate the informal and perhaps formal arrangements between censorship cartels like GARM and executive branch agencies. The Daily Wire has already filed a federal lawsuit against the State Department for allegedly doing just this. Second, Congress can itself stop engaging in violation of free speech principles. 2 weeks ago, writing in dissent in Murphy versus Missouri, Justice Alito condemned what he called sophisticated and coercive government campaigns against free speech. Members of this committee have engaged in precisely such campaigns. When Congressman Schiff speaks about targeting social media companies that must be, quote, pulled and dragged into this era of corporate responsibility because they are too tolerant of misinformation, he knows what he is doing. He is participating in a sophisticated, coercive campaign against free speech. When Congresswoman Jayapal blames social media for placing America at the, quote, precipice of a democratic crisis and calls on them to target they deem hate groups, she also knows what she is doing. She is participating in a sophisticated, coercive campaign against free speech. When Congressman Hank Johnson says, quote, we need a constitutional amendment to allow the legislature to control the so-called free speech rights of corporations, he also knows what he is doing. We all know what these government actors, what some people in this room, are doing. You're using the tacit threat of government action to compel private companies to throttle viewpoints you don't particularly like. The First Amendment was not designed to enable workarounds by elected officials. It was directed at Congress, at you, and you're abdicating your fundamental duty when you exert pressure on private companies to censor speech. Some in this room have been doing just that for years. We in the non-legacy media have been feeling the effects. In the name of the Constitution and in the name of democracy, this should stop.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. We now recognize Professor Waller.
Thank you. Chair Jordan, Ranking Member Nadler, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to present my views to you today. I am speaking solely in my personal capacity. I do not represent GARM or any of its member firms. I am concerned that the antitrust issues relating to today's hearings and the letters and document requests sent to the various companies do not conform to a consensus understanding of U.S. antitrust law by most courts and commentators. I only have access to publicly available information, so I cannot opine on whether there is or is not any specific antitrust violation. Instead, I present a roadmap of the many antitrust issues that would need to be addressed in a serious way before any real antitrust concerns exist in this matter. It's important to note that most members of GARM do not compete with each other, and each has unique needs for marketing and branding, including, as the other witnesses have already testified, having effective marketing campaigns and doing their best to avoid any harmful associations that damage their brand or simply drive away purchasers. With respect to the diverse coalition of firms in GARM, for example, Microsoft does not compete with McDonald's, Procter & Gamble or Unilever don't compete with Shell, a pharmaceutical company, or GroupM. And also, these firms do not generally compete with content providers such as Mr. Shapiro. Now, the activities of GARM do not appear from publicly available information to be a cartel as that term is understood in antitrust law. And cartels are a serious concern of antitrust laws, but they normally involve an agreement between competitors to fix prices, rig bids, limit production, divide markets, or otherwise interfere with quality, production, innovation. And instead, what we're talking about is the development of terms and definitions. They call it a lexicon. It is in some ways sort of like a dictionary. These terms do not affect the price, production, or quality of the goods and services sold by the members of GARM. Advertisers, media buyers, advertising agencies may or may not rely on the GARM terminology and may adopt any other criteria to determine how and where to place advertising. This is done in a public process. Everything is published and available to you. And this is very different from the secretive processes by which traditional cartels meet to create and enforce their unlawful agreements. In addition, there are, on its face, legitimate business justifications that the firms would be asserting, including protecting brand images and successful marketing strategies. These are two types of business justifications that are routinely considered in antitrust cases. And characterizing GARM's conduct as a boycott doesn't really change the antitrust analysis in any important way. Group boycotts are only per se unlawful when they're used to implement some otherwise unlawful cartel agreement or where firms with market power collectively deny a competitor access to some key source of supply it needs to survive. Separate from the traditional antitrust analysis that I've outlined in my opening statement and in my remarks and in my witness statement, the First Amendment and the interests of free expression also limit the application of antitrust laws in important ways. The Norr-Pennington Doctrine immunizes conduct that seeks to influence government action and public policy through a variety of techniques, including publicity campaigns. In short, an agreement by firms, if there is an agreement, is not an antitrust violation if it's designed to influence governmental action at any level of the government, federal, state, local, legislative, judicial, or executive branch. In addition, the Supreme Court and the lower courts have shown a separate and special caution for applying the antitrust laws to impose liability for political and social boycotts, even if that's what's going on, even if there is a degree of economic self-interest by the groups conducting the boycott. One example is that the Supreme Court has held that the First Amendment protects the civil rights boycott of white merchants in Mississippi by the NAACP, even though some other businesses may well have prospered or done more business because of that boycott. The committee's expressed concerns over the conduct examined today are not consistent with the consensus view of the antitrust law set forth in the leading cases. I agree with the chair that an individual decision to do business or not to do business is not covered by Section 1 of the Sherman Act. However, in addition to the lack of the other issues and evidence from the public available information, there are significant First Amendment implications raised by the actions of GARM. And these First Amendment issues suggest that even if the antitrust laws were fully justified and every issue in the antitrust roadmap were satisfied, there would be a plausible argument that the conduct was protected as a matter of speech and free implication. And I'm running out of time, but I also want to suggest that the policy implications of imposing antitrust liability in these circumstances should be quite concerning, regardless of one's political views. A leading treatise published by the ABA antitrust section states, boycotts are a common instrument for bringing about social change or advancing political, religious, or other non-commercial goals. And using the antitrust laws to challenge expressive conduct can interfere with commonplace forms of advocacy that are used by consumers, religious groups, political groups of all policy and persuasions. As a result, I do not see any benefit from further legislative action on these issues.
Thank you, Professor. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find myself a bit conflicted. I agree with both Mr. Waller and Mr. Shapiro on matters that they've mentioned. I mean, first of all, no matter how much gaslighting we've heard this morning, it's clear to me from the internal communications in the committee's report that GARM's objectives are clearly political, to use its influence among its members to suppress free speech and to financially harm outlets in which the leadership disagrees. I don't see any other reading of those communications that reaches any other conclusion. It's a manifestation of the ESG movement that has financially harmed so many companies that practice it. And there is a huge economic price to be paid for this conduct. Go woke, go broke is more than just a slogan. It's an economic fact. I mean, ask Disney, ask Budweiser. They pay the companies, I think, in GARM's case, are risking missing huge swaths of the market that they're seeking to reach. They pay a premium for ads in the forums they deliberately saturated. They miss bargains in the forums that they are, I'll use their word, throttling. And they risk alienating the consumers upon whom they rely for profits. I mean, I was a devoted, lifelong Gillette consumer until they launched their Men Are Pigs campaign in 2017. I haven't bought a Gillette product since. But that's their right as a company to alienate me as a consumer, and it's my right as a consumer to be alienated. Now, if I were a stockholder in GARM's member companies, I would be absolutely livid. I'd either be raising hell at stockholder meetings or withdrawing my investments or both. If I were a manager in any of these companies, I'd be livid also, and I'd be canceling my membership in GARM with a strong letter to follow. But here's the fine point of the matter. That's a beef between the company's stockholders and their management. It's a beef between GARM's member companies and GARM. It's a beef between those companies and their consumers. But it is not a beef between GARM or its member companies or their stockholders and consumers and this government. People have a right to their opinions and to express those opinions in any peaceful manner that they choose. Companies are simply a collection of people gathered together to pool their resources toward a common goal, whether it's to make money or advance a political cause or both. It's a little amusing to see that the Democrats suddenly championing this freedom because in GARM's case it benefits them, but rail against the very same freedom when it comes to such matters as Citizens United. For the left, their ethics are strictly situational, and as I've often warned on this committee, we can never allow them to become our teachers. Democracy extends beyond the political realm to the free market as well. In a free market, consumers vote every day with every dollar they spend on what the market will produce, who best produces it, what they're willing to pay, and who they'll buy it from. A free government exists to protect this right, and that's why I think we should be careful when we tread into this matter in the application of government power in disputes that are strictly between private parties. But I do think Mr. Shapiro is absolutely correct that if this government is in any way acting to pressure or nudge companies to censor speech or to corrupt their business decisions for political ends, we ought to vigorously act to stop that. But if they're just doing that to themselves, that's their right to make stupid decisions, and government also exists to protect that right. Mr. Shapiro, I'll give you the last word.
I mean, I agree with much of what you're saying. I think that the big concern for the Daily Wire and companies like ours is the nexus between government action and groups like GARM. And it appears clear to us that a well-meaning organization that simply wanted to appeal to the broadest possible audience would not be making political decisions about which outlets are too right or which outlets are too left. I'm perfectly fine with advertisers advertising on Pod Save America or on MSNBC. The problem that we have is an informal structure by which members of government, including this White House, have pressured social media companies in order to restrict their content. And everyone can see that. There's a lot of, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest going on from members of the government who then seem to be shocked when there's pushback from the right on exactly the same sort of matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Patel, has the Global Alliance for Responsible Media ever required that your company, Unilever, avoid advertising on any platform or website?
No, sir.
Mr. Jewell, same question. Has the Global Alliance for Responsible Media ever required GroupM to avoid advertising on any platform or website?
No, sir.
Mr. Jewell, has your company's participation in the Global Alliance for Responsible Media ever restricted your company's advertising decisions in any way?
No, it's completely optional.
Excuse me?
GARM is completely optional.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. Same question to you.
Yeah, it's completely voluntary.
Professor Waller, one of the goals of the Global Alliance for Responsible Media is to avoid having companies' advertising dollars funding online and offline harm, like the creation and dissemination of commercially exploitative and explicit images of children, or the funding of terrorism groups, or the promotion and dissemination of explicit images and depictions of crime outside of news stories and reporting. Is there any U.S. law that requires companies to advertise on every website and every platform?
No, there's not. A company can individually choose to do business or not do business with an advertiser, or advertising agency, or a platform.
Is there any law that requires companies to support, through advertising dollars, speech, content, or statements that they don't believe in?
There's no antitrust law that deals with that.
What would be the consequences if there were?
I can say that the Supreme Court has, expressed concern and not imposed liability. They typically don't force companies to do business with each other if they don't wish to. They're frankly more concerned about cartel agreements and the other thing, rather than forcing companies to continue to do business if they don't wish. They wish to encourage unilateral decisions about how to proceed in the real world as each company thinks best.
And that's what the Supreme Court has said.
Yes.
And what do you think about getting the Supreme Court for the moment, what do you think about the effects of such a law?
We want companies, the antitrust laws really do a couple of things. They prevent agreements that unreasonably harm competition. They prevent single firms from abusing their power, and they prevent mergers and acquisitions that can lead to either of those other problems I've already outlined. That's what the antitrust laws do. They don't generally micromanage the decisions of corporations as they decide what's best for them in the market.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must note once again that this sham investigation has revealed that these companies have broken no competition law. The investigation never should have started, but it certainly should have ended after the committee spoke to a representative of GARM and learned exactly what we all should know by now, that there is no basis for a claim of antitrust harm. But that does not mean that this investigation is harmless. The committee's power has been used to bully, intimidate, and impoverish any organization or company that dares to disagree with so-called conservative speech, in quotes. Speech that in many cases causes and spreads harm both online and offline. And I believe that that is exactly the purpose of this investigation, to misuse the power of this committee to bully, intimidate, and impoverish any organization or company that dares to disagree with so-called conservative speech. In other words, to intimidate the exercise of free speech, to impoverish organizations, to improperly use the power of this committee to force organizations to spend themselves into poverty, and thereby to inhibit and deter exercise of free speech. This is a gross misuse of the power of this committee. We have an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to have a constructive conversation about antitrust law and how we can help the American people. But unfortunately, this hearing is not it. This hearing is an exercise in intimidation of free speech, and it's shameful. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing here today. Mr. Jewell and Mr. Patel, your companies and your clients, you as an individual company, are both sit on the steering committee for GARM. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And with the steering committee, there's been a number of standards that have been developed by GARM. And Mr. Patel, you mentioned your company, Unilever, has developed its own set of standards. Have you adopted the standards of GARM as part of your standards as well in advertisement placement?
Firstly, Unilever created its own standards in 2018, and then there was an industry need to create some standardization, which is what GARM was born for in 2019.
My question was, though, did your company adopt those GARM standards from 2019?
We adopt the GARM standards.
Okay. And Mr. Jewell, how many of your clients have adopted the GARM standards?
GARM exists to create the framework and the definitions that we've used.
So this is, we get that. I've read your statement. How many of your companies, how many companies do you represent?
We represent thousands.
And how many of those companies have accepted and adopted the GARM standards?
I couldn't give you an exact number, but I would tell you most of our major advertisers use GARM as a foundation, and then we build upon that for whatever their custom preferences are for whatever their particular suitability might be.
Okay. And do you, as part of the steering committee, do you have regular discussions with GARM and its leadership, of which you're a part, regarding placement of advertisements?
I do not meet with
Standards.
them. I do not meet with GARM on a regular basis. I've actually never met with them.
Your company?
The company would, yes.
Okay. Mr. Patel?
The company would meet, but we 100% decide where our marketing investment goes. That's Unilever's decision.
So Mr. Rakowitz, who works for GARM, he's kind of the face of GARM in some respects. Have you, either of you or your company, dealt with Mr. Rakowitz in communicating about advertisement placement and subject matter?
I haven't met Mr. Reckerswood, but we have a member that sits on the steercom.
Yes. Okay. So let's get to that for a second. In 2020, Rob Master, Vice President of Media and Digital Engagement at Unilever, sent an email to Facebook about a presidential ad, and he was concerned about it violating the Facebook policies. Are you familiar with that situation, Mr. Patel?
I wasn't part of the communication, but I have seen the communication that you're referring to, and I think what I interpret from it, he was checking what was Facebook's policy on it.
I find it interesting that the way you couched that, you were checking what Facebook's policy was. Weren't you really, your staff, really checking to see if it was consistent with your own policy, I would assume, right?
No, sir, we don't decide on what media content goes up or goes down. That's up for the media platforms to decide.
But when you're looking for ad safety placement, you're not concerned then whether that was consistent with Facebook's policy? You're just basically inquiring with Facebook's policy, not concerned with your own policy of placement?
What we do is we decide all our marketing investment. We'll decide on target audiences where we want our brands to appear.
So why were you inquiring whether that was a violation of Facebook's policy?
So I'm not clear on why Rob Masters sent that communication, but as I said, we decide where we want to put our ads with whichever social media.
I appreciate that you decide where you place your ads. The question, though, is why are you then going to Facebook and saying, does this ad meet your criterion? Because that indicates you're trying to influence Facebook, because in reality, your position is we're going to place it wherever we think is best. But there's an ad over here, a specific ad that you're asking, does that meet your policy? That seems to intimidate. That seems to imply that you want to question their policy, what their platform is doing before you bother to place your ad. But you didn't do it that way. You just wanted to know whether it met their policy. You didn't say, we're not going to do it because we don't like it. That indicates you're interfering in YouTube's policy decision. Yield.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Well, I really like my colleague on the other side, but I did not understand that argument. Antitrust enforcement is experiencing a real renaissance under the Biden administration. Our antitrust enforcers have won victories in court against employers that sought to suppress worker pay, successfully fought to lower the price of inhalers, and are working to lower food prices by targeting anti-competitive practices in the grocery industry. The list of antitrust accomplishments under this administration is unprecedented, and the American people have noticed. It is unfortunate that this majority has not moved forward with the bipartisan package of antitrust bills that we passed under Democrats in the 117th Congress that would have protected small businesses and consumers across the country as they were demanding to be able to have more competition, to be able to lower their prices, and to protect their ability as small businesses to compete. If we are concerned about the trustworthiness of media, and we want to foster more responsible media, then I would suggest we take up my bipartisan Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Let's debate that. Let's make sure independent publishers across the country, newspapers and small communities across the country can survive. But that's not what's happening. We've begun to see some colleagues on the other side co-opt the language of antitrust enforcement to target behaviors that have nothing to do with antitrust. I know that the details of antitrust law are confusing, so I want to clarify a few specific legal points in plain English. Professor Waller, as an expert on antitrust law and in plain English, can you explain what kinds of anti-competitive behavior our antitrust laws are designed to prevent?
Sure, and as a teacher, I try to explain complex things in plain language, so I appreciate your approach. I can give examples just in the real world. Over the years, the Justice Department has brought criminal antitrust cases against global cartels that have raised the price of vitamins, food additives, and in smaller cases, road building and other expenses that taxpayers bear. This has been a traditional priority of antitrust enforcement. As you know, both the FTC and the Department of Justice have major Section 2 cases going on, both in the tech sector and otherwise, going after powerful firms that they're alleging have violated the antitrust laws, abusing monopoly power by a single firm, whether it's Amazon, Live Nation, Google, et cetera. They're in various stages. And there are pending mergers cases, such as the supermarket merger that's being now litigated by the FTC in 30-some states, where the consequences are likely, if the government's right, higher food prices as well as harm to labor if that merger goes through as currently proposed. Those are some of the priorities.
Perfect. And actually that Kroger's-Albertson merger, there was an article on the front page of the Seattle Times today. Over 150 stores will close in my area, just in Seattle, as a result of that merger. Now, you touched on this in your prepared statement, and I know you only have access to public information about the facts in this case, but given those constraints, do you see any of these antitrust elements in the information that was uncovered by my Republican colleagues?
Based on what I've seen, I do not at this stage, and based on publicly available information, GARM appears to be very different from either a trade association or even a traditional standard-setting body. They do not appear to be creating binding industry standards that determine whether products and services can be sold. They are creating sets of terms that firms can use or not use to make decisions that they each do in the marketplace.
So another fruitless investigation in this Congress. I would also add that Project 2025, the radical right-wing plan for a second Trump administration, calls for more of these ideologically driven attacks on private actors in its section on the FTC, cloaking these culture war attacks in the popular rhetoric of antitrust and market power. On a different note, Mr. Patel, and quickly, how do you think consumers might view your products if they were advertised alongside hateful, vile, or dangerous content like anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, child sexual abuse material, or content promoting terrorism?
It would create severe damage to the brand equity that we built for decades and decades.
Thank you. In fact, one of our witnesses has repeatedly made hateful and derogatory comments about LGBTQ plus people in the past. Mr. Shapiro has argued that transgender and gay Americans suffer from a, quote, psychological disorder or mental illness and has denigrated same-sex couples raising children. I and my fellow Americans consider this deeply offensive, hateful, and in fact, an analysis in 2023 found that a network of Facebook pages connected with Mr. Shapiro's website had, quote, earned over 17 million interactions from nearly 13,000 posts with transgender-related keywords. I yield back.
Mr. Patel, are you part of an organization that uses market power for censorship?
No, sir.
And how much advertising capital do you deploy annually?
How much marketing investment do we spend?
Yeah.
850 million a year.
And you spend, you said less than 1% of that in the news area, right?
Yes, sir.
And that's because really your brands don't want to be involved in these caustic news disputes or political disputes. They want to be apolitical in the presentation of their brand. Am I understanding that testimony correctly?
So we serve 90% of American households with our portfolio.
It's a fascinating answer, just not to my question. Is the reason you de-emphasize news because you want to be apolitical?
We target our investment to address the consumers that buy our brands.
Okay, are you doing so for political reasons or apolitical reasons?
We don't do it for any political reason.
Okay, so then why are the vice presidents of your company trying to shape the way Facebook limits view of a Trump advertisement?
So I'm not sure what the intention of that communication was, but that's
I do. It was to get the Trump ad taken down. It's pretty clear. You had two vice presidents, Rob Master and Luis DeComo, who were pressuring Facebook to utilize Facebook's policies to take down a Trump ad. So it's just hard to believe that your goal is to avoid politics when not some intern at your company, but the vice presidents at Unilever are writing Facebook saying, we want you to take this Trump ad down and apply these policies to do it.
So I'm not sure what the intention of communication was, but
okay, I'll tell you what, I'll read you the communication. It's 2 words. It's your vice president to Garm when they were trying to get the Facebook ad taken out. It said, honestly reprehensible. So you're using this $800 million plus power that you have over the marketplace. Facebook is craving your advertising dollars, and you have 2 vice presidents hammering Facebook to take down a Trump ad about whether or not Joe Biden should have his ear inspected for an earpiece. That was what the ad was about, that you all found so reprehensible.
So respectfully, I'm not sure that word was done by a Unilever person.
You're okay. So Mr. DeComo didn't work for Unilever?
He sits on the. If I did my homework right, I think that came from the GARM, Rob.
Oh, Rob Rankowitz. Yes. And you are member entities to GARM. You pay GARM. You guys are GARM. I mean, as Mr. Jewell said, you guys you have to have tools in order to help you place your ads. So you go fund GARM, and then here your vice presidents are commiserating with GARM over the fact that Facebook won't remove this. I guess, Mr. Shapiro, when we look at these big advertising platforms and they're hearing the people with the advertising dollars hammer them with this ideological tilt, what does that do to the marketplace for ideas?
Obviously, it shuts down the marketplace of ideas, which is largely the intent. And one of the things that I've heard from some of the Democratic members of the committee today is an extraordinary amount of projection. Projection wherein they suggest that Republican members of the committee are trying to shut down free speech by trying to get answers to questions about the kind of political pressures that are being put on social media companies, for example. But it's been Democrats who, for years, have been spending their time trying to pressure social media companies into doing their bidding by limiting the types of information that are available to the public and how that information is actually distributed. One of the things that's worth noting here is that it's not just a matter of advertising dollars flowing. The way that it works on social media is that if you are demonetized, then the reach of your actual content is also limited by the same social media companies.
Do you think the frequency of those demonetization rises when you have vice presidents of companies at Unilever trying to hammer entities like Facebook into taking down Trump ads?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question that when you have internal pressures put on social media companies to take down right-wing material, that has an impact on the reach of right-wing messaging. There's just no question.
And I guess I don't mind when Democrats say they don't like conservative speech, or we get to say we don't like some of their speech. That's how this works. But it's when the business community colludes and utilizes market power to shape the way social media companies or websites disseminate information that the public doesn't even get to see that debate and engage it. And I think the fact that it's clandestine is actually even more corrosive to the values that undergird.
That's absolutely true. The complete lack of transparency with which GARM treats both the member companies as well as the consuming public is one of the major problems. If they simply wish to levy a boycott against a right-wing source, they should simply say that's what they're doing. Hiding behind fake standards in order to project objectivity is a major problem in transparency for the market.
Mr. Cohen's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, thank you, Mr. Chair. This issue was already raised, as I understand it, and addressed in a transcribed interview with a representative of GARM. As that witness stated, and as I'm sure the representatives from GroupM and Unilever would likewise note, they are not responsible for creating or implementing Facebook's ad policies. That's something Facebook does. They are, as advertisers, though, rightly concerned about the uniform enforcement of those policies. As the witness stated, quote, "You can't imagine a global marketer if they are trying to run a campaign across platforms or across markets, and if they start hitting those inconsistencies where there are actions taken against advertising messages and campaigns that are not clear, they are not transparent. It creates disruption because it's like all of a sudden I now actually have an outage in my campaign and I'm not going to be able to reach as many consumers. I'm not going to get business results. The company is not going to perform. Stock market prices, it's all there. Basically, supply and demand is all very American. It's what we're all about, capitalism. Is that, Mr. Patel, is that pretty much correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I would appreciate your... The app was not taken down. The ad was not taken down, was it?
Not to my understanding.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I was in transportation working on some issues there and came here to what I think is a rather bizarre hearing, not the first we've had in this committee. It's our second hearing ostensibly charging specific groups with illegal conduct without a single expert witness to lay out that conduct and how that conduct violates the law. This is the Judiciary Committee. We're supposed to be looking about law, violation of law, legal experts. Nada. We did have 2 oversight hearings of the antitrust enforcement agencies, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. We had 2 top enforcement officials here. Not once did any member bring up Global Alliance for Responsible Media, GroupM, Unilever, or any of this. So when Republicans had the opportunity to ask antitrust experts, they didn't. Today we have 2 witnesses, a large advertiser and a large advertising buyer, who are testifying why the Republicans just have it factually wrong. And we have a talk show host who is bitter that corporations do not want to buy his program. It's a good thing we have an esteemed antitrust expert with us today, Professor Waller. He diligently and politely explained why this legal theory that there is some antitrust violation designed to censor conservatives is bunk. So that is the evidence we have before us. Thank you, Mr. Waller. The legal theory is bunk. Clean that up a bit. The Republicans have it backwards. Their cry against censorship is nothing more than an attempt to bully, or as they would like it, compel by law, companies to associate themselves with individuals and content creators that companies believe are harmful and pay them. Seriously, you think Unilever should be forced to advertise and in doing so financially support posts about rape or domestic violence? That's not the American way. We let the private enterprise capitalistic system determine where they want to advertise. And that is the record that's coming out in this hearing, is that they want to force Unilever to do certain things. This is a real concern. We have images that show how a company has legitimate business interest, and I would argue a social obligation not to support this type of harmful conduct and then be associated with it. It also gets free speech wrong, as Professor Waller explained. This isn't about government censoring anyone. It's about trying to use the antitrust laws and enforcements to compel speech. The Republicans must read the Constitution in a funhouse mirror. It's very much out of focus and weird shapes, and they pick out what they want, and then they come out of the funhouse and maybe they wake up. With that, I have a couple of questions. And I haven't read Project 2025, so that could all be in Project 2025 when they want to turn America over. This may be part of it. Mr. Patel, Mr. Shapiro, or is it Shapiro?
It's Shapiro.
Shapiro, thank you. I had an uncle, he was Shapiro, and then his son became Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro says the Democrats are using the tacit threat of government action to compel private companies to throttle viewpoints that we don't like. Do you know what chutzpah is?
Sorry, sir?
You know what chutzpah is?
No, sir.
Well, that's chutzpah. We're literally in a hearing where the Republicans are using the power of this committee, not tacitly threaten, but actually accuse.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Companies of illegal activity and investigate them because they don't like their viewpoint. A very sensible viewpoint, I would argue, that they don't want to be associated with hate speech or domestic violence or rape or harassment. You wouldn't want to be associated with anything to deal with somebody who went into Bergdorf Goodman and got a woman and took her into a locked dressing room and molested her. No, you wouldn't want to do that. And you wouldn't want to be, I can go on and on and on about that deal. So I'll yield right now and the balance of my time, and thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Democrats must have been given their talking points on Project 2025 yesterday at the internal meeting of the conference to determine who the next presidential candidate will be for the Democrat Party. This is the second committee I've sat through this morning, including financial services, and Project 2025 has come up at least a dozen times. I just find that interesting. Mr. Patel, Unilever is a publicly traded company, meaning you have fiduciary duty to deliver returns to shareholders, correct?
Yes, sir.
In your 2023 annual report, you identify consumer preferences as a principal risk to your business. In examining this risk, you stated our success depends on value and relevance of our brands and products to consumers around the world. Would you agree that it's got to be a critical element in managing that risk because you have to continue to grow consumer preference of your brands, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. And you do that through brand and marketing investments, or advertisements, I guess is another way of describing that, right?
That's how we build brands.
But between 2021 and 2023, Unilever spent more than $23 billion on brand and marketing investments. That's a fairly big chunk of your operating costs, I'm sure. Would it be fair to say that Unilever believes brand marketing delivers a positive return on investment?
So that's why we invest, to build our brands and the equity, and that's why we're in 90% of U.S. households.
Right, but if consumer preference is still at risk, you could always do better, correct? I mean, that's obviously the goal.
The business could always grow better.
Right. So let me ask you this. If consumer preference is vital to the success of your company, you acknowledge that a principal risk and commit billions of dollars each year to mitigating that risk, then why would you boycott companies that reach millions of consumers? It doesn't make any sense. You've got this goal in place, you're pursuing it, but yet you're still pursuing boycotts.
So we don't boycott. We have a clear internal process. Our brands have jobs to be done. We have target audiences that we look for our brands. Actually, 80% of our marketing spend goes between 18 and 49-year-old women because they make 80% of the purchasing decisions for our business. And that's how we set our choices on investment. What's right for our brands to give us the best business return on investment.
What about Twitter? Has there been any boycotting of Twitter? It would be in the best interest of growing your consumer preference and delivering returns to shareholders to have to utilize Twitter to make sure that your brands are continuing to grow, right?
So on Twitter, or X as it's known now, there was a period in 2019, 2020, due to brand safety, that we pulled our investment, but we have now returned to Twitter across the world.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Shapiro, can you explain the importance, I don't want to oversimplify this, can you explain the importance of advertising dollars to growing Daily Wire into the company that it is today?
Sure. So the truth is that advertising dollars represent a far smaller share of the revenue of the Daily Wire than they did at the very beginning. When you're first starting a company, the possibility of starting it off the basis of subscribers alone is very difficult because you actually don't have tremendous market reach. The gradual increase in revenue is largely due to advertiser revenue. So at the beginning of the Daily Wire, nearly 100% of all revenue that we had when we were building the business was based on advertising revenue. Today, it's significantly smaller than that because we have a very large subscriber base. So the principal threat that I'm here to talk about is not about the bitterness of my company, which continues to be, thank God, highly successful. The reason that I'm here is to talk about startup companies that are attempting to get into the market and are being barred from an extraordinarily large pool of advertising revenue along political lines.
Do you believe there is collective boycotts that are happening?
There's no question there are collective boycotts happening, and I will say that I do appreciate the chutzpah of some of the Democratic members of Congress, and I'm charmed by their newfound love for free markets and corporate free speech. That one seems to be a bit of a new one to me, but it is charming only in that it requires you to ignore many of the statements that they have made historically about the amount of pressure they would love to bring on private companies when it comes to free speech. And here I will quote the ranking member, quote, "These platforms are utilized as conduits to spread vitriolic hate messages into every home and country. Efforts by media companies to counter this surge have fallen short. Social network platforms continue to be used as ready avenues to spread dangerous white nationalist speech." Or, that was from 2019, from 2020, it goes way beyond the fact that big tech misbehaves. It's the fact this kind of power exists. That kind of power cannot be allowed to exist in society. When you use that sort of language with regard to the same companies we're now hearing require free speech, I find that somewhat difficult to swallow.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a sham hearing railing against a made-up boogeyman. I'm not normally up here defending big business, and as Mr. Shapiro noted, I have said repeatedly that we need to limit the massive dark money spending that big business pours into our politics and also pours into our Supreme Court. But let's talk about what's really happening here. Corporate brands care about their reputation because they sell more products if they have a good public image. And these companies think it's bad for business to run their advertising content next to child porn or ISIS videos or hate speech or an advertisement from the Heritage Foundation about Project 2025, which is so alarming to most Americans. Americans are alarmed, and that's why their representatives are talking about Project 2025, a 900-page manifesto, which is the blueprint for the Trump administration, should he be so fortunate and we be so unfortunate that he be reelected. Nobody wants their advertisements running against that kind of content. Foreign propaganda, networked disinformation campaigns. So these brands are working together to demand greater transparency and accountability from platforms regarding where their ads are placed and what kinds of content the ads are monetizing. That just sounds to me like good common business sense. Am I right about that, Mr. Patel?
Yes, sir.
And how about you, Mr. Jewell? Am I right or am I wrong?
That's correct, sir.
Thank you. But that's not really why we're here. This do-nothing Congress has nothing to run on this fall. They started out this Congress with 15 rounds of voting to elect a speaker, and then they promptly proceeded to throw the speaker out, and they wasted another 3 weeks trying to put in another speaker. MAGA Republicans have given us 2 years of dysfunction. 2 years. And they don't have anything to show for it but a few rabbit hole investigations of the Biden corrupt crime family, allegedly. $20 million in taxpayer money spent between two committees investigating the president with the aim of impeachment, and we saw where that went. So they have nothing, absolutely nothing to show for their dysfunction. And so what they're now trying to do is gin up their base against this made-up boogeyman and give a platform to extreme voices who want to spread misinformation. The American people know better, and they want a Congress that will work on behalf of real Americans on real problems. Instead of this sham hearing, we should be working on protecting and strengthening our democracy, which is about to be undermined should Project 2025 go into effect. Mr. Professor Waller, Mr. Shapiro's testimony states that, quote, GARM acts as a cartel, end quote. You are an expert in antitrust law, are you not?
I've devoted a lot of my career to studying it.
Can you explain why that assertion is false?
I have not seen any evidence and publicly available information that suggests that GARM plays a role like a traditional cartel. It does not consist primarily of firms that compete with each other, and they are not agreeing on the price, amount, or other kinds of market division that a cartel normally does and is normally punished for it if you can prove.
So this hearing is pretty much false advertisement, wouldn't you say?
Well, I would just caution all members of the committee just not to fall in the trap that sometimes my students do, which when they see something that they don't like, they think it's either an antitrust violation or a violation of the Constitution. It's just not necessarily true.
Well, gosh, I really hope that Project 2025 does not come into play, because if it does, we'll be having a whole lot more hearings like this, sham hearings on issues that actually suppress the rights of the people and even business owners to conduct business in a business-like fashion. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jewell, what's uncommon collaboration?
Uncommon collaboration?
Yep. This is from the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, your working charter, priorities for uncommon collaboration. I just want to know what you guys say is uncommon collaboration.
Well, I can't speak for GARM, but I think what
you're on the board, right? You're on the steer team, your company.
my company's on the steering team. I think what they're referring to
Founding
here,
member.
what they're referring to
Are you a
here-
founding member? GroupM's a founding
Yes.
member of
Yes.
GARM, right?
Yes.
So I'm asking this is your charter, your working charter. What's uncommon collaboration?
I believe what they're referring to is a cross-industry collaboration between agencies, brands, technology companies, ad tech companies.
Well, that's all warm and fuzzy, but here's what Mr. Rakowitz, the guy you guys hired to run GARM, here's what he says. Uncommon collaboration is competitors working together. Competitors working together to rise above individual commercial interest. Uncommon collaboration needs to be understood as the industry coming together, putting aside competitive concerns. Mr. Waller just said we don't have a cartel here, but that sounds a lot like a cartel to me. Would you agree? Sounds a lot like limiting actions that would limit consumer choice. That sounds like unlawful restraint of trade, and all that stuff is illegal according to the Sherman Act. What do you think, Mr. Jewell?
What's the question? Sorry?
The same question. You're trying to tell me. I asked what uncommon collaboration is, which is from your working charter, GARM's working charter. And Mr. Rakowitz defines uncommon collaboration as rising above individual commercial interests. I thought a company was focused on their commercial interests of their individual company.
Sir, GARM is used for framework and definitions to try and make order of something that quite honestly had no order to begin with.
Well, here's what GARM did. Here's what it looks like, I think, in practice. Can we put up let's put up the email from Mr. Montgomery, who works for Mr. Jewell's company, email about Breitbart, the Daily Wire, and Fox News. There's an interesting parallel here with Breitbart. As much as we hated their ideology and blank, we couldn't really justify blocking them for misguided opinion. I don't know the Daily Wire that well, but we should watch them carefully too. If we block the Daily Wire, why wouldn't we block Fox News? That seems to me like uncommon collaboration in practice, focused on 3 conservative news outlets. Do you see it that way, Mr. Jewell?
Respectfully, no, sir.
Well, how do you see it then?
I see this is somebody from our brand safety team, and he's asking questions about what sort of standards of service they have and trying to figure out what is happening with that particular publisher.
Well, let's put up the next one. Let's show some more uncommon collaboration in practice. Put up the next one. This is the one about Twitter. Based on your recommendations, we have stopped all paid advertisement because the platform was rather unsafe. This is their opinion due to Elon Musk's decision to firing lotteries. This is when Elon Musk bought Twitter. But it's an important platform for us to reach our audience, so we would like to consider going back. Looks like this was a coordinated, uncommon collaboration to boycott Twitter, but this company wants to go back because they make a lot of money when they're advertising on Twitter. Is that what this uncommon collaboration is that GARM engages in, Mr. Jewell?
We're not party to this email, so I can't really speak to this. We actually have been big supporters of Twitter and X. Recently, 2 weeks ago, we met with Mr. Musk, introduced her to our advertisers. To be clear, we want more choice in this industry, more places to create trusted brand advertising.
Mr. Shapiro, it's been cited several times. I think Mr. Nadler said this in an opening statement. A number of the people said that they come together, they collaborate, they collude, they come together because they don't want to be advertising on sites where there's terrorism, piracy, harmful images of children, or other crimes on those associated with those websites. Any of that activity take place on the Daily Wire website?
No, it most certainly is not.
Yeah. So that's just we're all against that stuff. What we're not for is this colluding, this collaboration to go after to limit advertising because you don't like their ideology, you don't like their politics. That's what we're focused on, and that's exactly what's going on out there. And frankly, as you said in your opening statement, anybody can see it.
Yeah, the emails that you're showing, I've yet to see an email on the other side suggesting the possibility of divestment from CNN, for example.
Yeah, and trust me, we did a lot of investigating. We'd have had that, we'd have put it in our report. Didn't find a one. Didn't find a one. It was all targeted in one direction, and they say it in their charter document. And Mr. Rakowitz says uncommon collaboration is limiting the choice of, it makes absolutely no sense to me. That I will recognize the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the witnesses as well, and let's talk a little bit about brand reputation, if we may. We all know that how important brand reputation is. As Warren Buffett has said, it takes 20 years to build a brand and 5 minutes to destroy it. Let me start out with Mr. Patel, the question, sir. In 2020, Unilever paused all social media advertising because the environment had become very polarized and unhelpful to its brand. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Let me say consumers agree with you that, in fact, 82% of consumers also feel that it is important that the content surrounding online ads be appropriate. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to submit for the record an article titled Brand Safety, What Do Consumers Consider to Be Inappropriate Content? So, Mr. Patel, I'm going to ask again. Unilever paused advertising on both conservative and liberal channels and did not specifically target conservative platforms or content creators. Is that correct? And that's for 2020.
Yes, sir. We pulled all our advertising from all assets.
So, Mr. Patel, it sounds like this is more of a pure business decision and not a messaging crusade on your part. Would you agree with that?
No, we did what was felt was best for our brands.
Business decision.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Patel, you've testified that Unilever, you make decisions to advertise independently. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We make our investments on what's right for our brands. And
no group, including GARM, dictates or approves where Unilever spends its advertising dollars. Is that correct?
100%. Unilever makes its own decisions.
And no group directs Unilever to avoid any platform or creator. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Patel, members of GARM can come and go freely like X, formerly Twitter, have done. Is that correct?
GARM is a voluntary organization.
Okay. Professor Waller, if I may, some on this committee have suggested that members of GARM have colluded to harm competition by boycotting certain platforms or speakers. Don't businesses have the fundamental right to choose how and where they spend their advertising dollars?
That is correct.
And it's clear from Mr. Patel's answers and the public documents that there is no collusion. Would you agree with that?
I can only say as a matter of, I have not read the committee's report, and based on publicly available information, I'm seeing a discussion of unilateral decisions on how to do business, which is the purview of each company, and you simply need more. You need more, even if other firms are doing similar or even identical decisions. The law is clear that you need something that shows that they're acting in a way together rather than independent. And I see you have an element of antitrust violation.
Well,
chart
what you
behind
have
you.
behind me, sir, Mr. Waller, is a chart of the 3 elements, the mandatory elements of a Sherman Act Section 1 violation. You need to prove all 3 elements. So, Mr. Waller, let me ask you, are you aware of any agreement among the competitors to boycott or collude?
Well, I have no personal agreement, but I'm not hearing anything today that suggests that. And in the absence of an agreement, I can just say there is no Section 1 violation.
So if there's no agreement, there can't be a Section 1 antitrust violation.
That is true.
So there's no antitrust violation.
If there's no agreement, there's no Section 1. And then there are other requirements that your chart has, 2 additional requirements. You have to show an unreasonable harm to competition. There's one, in addition, I would suggest that if the firms involved have a legitimate business justification for what they do, that is often enough to avoid a violation, even if there were an agreement.
That's a lot. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Professor Waller, you were a senior advisor to the federal, over here. You were a senior advisor to the Federal Trade Commission under Lena Khan, right?
That is correct.
And when you left, did you take copies of your work product?
No.
Are you aware that the FTC deleted them all and would not make them available to this committee, so we have no idea what you did?
I have no idea what the FTC did after I left.
But you didn't take any copies. Under oath, you're telling us that you have no records of your time there, your opinions, or what you did there.
No. In fact, I was prohibited from doing so. I turned in my computer, my phone, and I have no access to any of that stuff.
Okay, well, that's fine. So they just destroyed the evidence. The Federal Trade Commission under Chairwoman Khan has found everything to be antitrust. They haven't found a merger or an acquisition they seem to like, even if they're unrelated. Were you part of that decision? In other words, when they've decided that the only way you can merge or acquire somebody is if it hurts your ability to compete, were you part of that? Because today you're talking about nothing is, you know, what we're seeing here, which clearly smells like a cartel, certainly looks like a suppression of free speech. You're saying none of it is. You've testified repeatedly that you see no there, and yet you were part of the FTC, which sees a there everywhere. Can you explain that quickly?
I'm providing a roadmap of all the issues that I think this committee would have to find solid evidence on to proceed.
I find your behavior and the behavior of the Federal Trade Commission under your participation to be inconsistent with your testimony, and as a result have to discount your opinions a considerable amount. For Mr. Patel and Mr. Jurel, Unilever is based where?
The U.S. is...
No. Where is the stockholding parent company?
London, sir.
London. So you're not a U.S.-based company other than you're a division of a foreign company. Is that correct?
We're based, headquarters London.
Okay. That's okay. You've got a wonderful British accent. It's fine. I like that, actually. So where is GARM based? The answer is Belgium. It's not hard.
Actually, I'm not sure where GARM is based.
Okay, well, our information shows it's Belgium. So a non-U.S. company working with a non-U.S. consortium that controls 90% of advertising, all of which is outside the U.S. and outside the reach of really being discovered, wants to tell us it's not a cartel. You know, the one thing about a cartel is the first way you know it's a cartel is it says it's not a cartel. I think that's really what we're dealing with here. I would ask Mr. Waller, except that I find him inconceivably disingenuous when what he's saying today doesn't seem to be consistent with where he was working till recently. So I'll go to Mr. Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro, do you have more than 10% market share in the advertising or social media work?
We certainly do not.
You don't. So you don't have any market power.
Very little.
Okay, but if you had control or influence over 90% of it, do you think that the Federal Trade Commission would be up your derriere every day with questions? I didn't use the Yiddish term because I was afraid.
Even as things currently stand, I overpay my taxes.
Okay. So basically, what we're dealing with here today is you, Fox, the others, don't have individually enough market share to have market power so that you can control a market. But clearly, GARM's influence does have 90% of the advertisers, and according to everything we've seen, you've been blacklisted by them.
That seems to be the case.
Now, the late Roger Ailes was a friend of mine. I thoroughly enjoyed my time and the guidance he gave me. But he also gave Rupert Murdoch a piece of guidance, and it is true till today. He found a niche that the company that became Fox News could fill. And he said, Mr. Murdoch, I found a niche I think we can exploit. And he said, well, what is it? He said, it's half of America. So can you explain in 35 seconds or less, more or less, one, if you know that chutzpah means nerve. I'm afraid most people aren't good in Yiddish here, apparently, although they use it. But can you explain to me why systematically, whether it's one conservative media or not, that GARM is seemingly wanting us, an outside the U.S. group, wanting not to have 50% of Americans hear advertising and, as a result, see profitable networks?
It seems to me there are a variety of reasons why a group like GARM is attempting to withdraw the advertising market from half of American businesses that happen to be on the right side of the aisle. Those reasons range from the overtly political to the fact that they coordinate with foreign governments. GARM actually does coordinate in Europe with a bunch of European governments in consolidating standards and all the rest, and they obviously don't have the same First Amendment restrictions that they do in the United States. These sorts of informal arrangements are then carried across the pond here and incentivized by, again, members of this body, members of the executive branch, who put pressure on social media companies in order to throttle particular viewpoints.
Mr. Chairman, I would certainly say for the record that if you disenroll half of America's access, that's chutzpah.
Yep. The gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Responsible advertising standards are being questioned here today, and we should not be using taxpayer dollars to speak on an issue that has been investigated and produced no support for any unlawfulness. We need to trust the facts that we have gathered, not chase conspiracy theories or force companies to make investments against their will. There are so many issues that we could be focusing on here today that would actually kind of save millions of lives, such as gun violence prevention, or better serve the American people and make a positive and meaningful difference in the lives of those that we are sworn to serve. We could focus on measures to reform our prisons and protect our children from online violence, or we could make a good faith effort to protect the First Amendment. We have urged our colleagues on this committee time and time again to follow the facts and resist the urge to chase down unbiased claims for political clout. We should be using tax dollars to help the very people who pay them. Instead of some of my colleagues in the majority are wasting money so that they may spread falsehoods and distract the public from their inability to effectively legislate. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being on this panel today. But I do have a number of questions, so if you don't mind just kind of answering it succinctly as you possibly can, I appreciate it. Professor Weber-Waller, in the research that you have obtained on the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, are members of GARM within their First Amendment right to voluntarily decide whether to place their advertisements on a certain website or platform?
Yes.
Thank you. Is this true even if multiple members of GARM make the same decision voluntarily?
Yes.
In 2020, Spotify entered into an exclusive deal with a podcaster for $100 million. And on this podcast, the host shared COVID misinformation, including suggesting that healthy young adults did not need to be vaccinated, leading prominent artists to leave Spotify over this. Grossly inflammatory language was constantly being used, including using the N-word repeatedly over a several period of years. Mr. Patel and Mr. Jewell, can you explain why brands would not like to have their advertisements appear alongside this kind of audio content?
From a Unilever perspective, it would create damage to what the brands stand for and the equity that we've built for many decades around why they exist.
Thank you.
From our perspective, it's much similar. Companies spend billions of dollars over decades building their brands, committing certain values, making it feel safe, making it feel useful, making it earn its place in consumers' lives. When you put it next to something like that, at a time when there's a massive health crisis and these types of comments come out, it destroys those billions of dollars that they've invested over long periods of time.
Thank you for those clarifications. Mr. Patel and Mr. Jewell, how do your companies determine what platforms and products you wish to use for your advertisements?
From a Unilever lens, what we do is, and it's different for every brand, we have a job to be done for the brand. We have target audiences, so we have selective demographics that we're trying to address through the brand equity, and then the team locally will work with the GroupM to understand where that content is, and then we'll target that through our advertising.
Thank you.
I think that's exactly right. If you want to introduce a new pickup truck in America, you're going to go out and figure out who is most likely to buy that, and how do I match the brand values of what that truck is with the audience segments. So I'll make it up, but we're going to find men between 24 and 35 who believe in durability, toughness, and they like the message appeal of Made in America. We're going to go find the news outlets that represent that audience best and connect them to that audience.
Thank you for those clarifications, Mr. Patel and Mr. Jewell. If the committee decides today that companies must advertise on platforms that are not aligned with their brand, how could this affect the future of advertisements?
Respectfully, ma'am, what we believe is that we have a right to choose where we want to choose our investments and where we want to advertise our brands.
I agree with that.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, hang on for one second. We've been at it a couple hours. If any of you need a break, just please let us know. We'll take a break, but you've got several to go. Just let our staff know. We'll go. Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We know from hearings in this committee that in the 2020 election that ads were throttled from President Trump. And Mr. Jewell, what is GroupM doing to make sure that President Trump's ads are not going to be throttled here in the 2024 election?
Thank you for the question. GroupM works with all of our different publishers and partners to enforce their standards of service, to make sure that we look at what those are. And that's part of the reason that we actually use GARM and others, is to get an industry framework and guidelines and use third parties to look at the content that comes through and make sure that it's performing as it should.
So will you be watching companies like Google, like Meta, like X to make sure that they are not throttling information coming from conservatives and in particular President Trump?
We actually work with all the major publishers around the world, and certainly here in the United States, and meet with them on a regular basis to talk about their standards of service, their policies, and make sure that they are living to those standards of service. It's really important to us to have choice in this marketplace and to be able to connect our brands and consumers in a wide variety of organizations.
So there's a real concern that we see this email. There were some emails that were posted earlier. We have one here from Joe Barone, Managing Partner, Brand Safety Americas. We confirmed with Spotify that GroupM Brand Safety Team will conduct a complete trust and safety review. This was after, this was in response to Joe Rogan being on Spotify. Spotify said, we do not want to take Joe Rogan down. And you guys put additional pressure on. How can we be confident with something like that happening? Is Mr. Barone still working for GroupM?
No, sir, he's not.
Okay, so we can be confident something like this will not happen again, where you guys use actually kind of secondary power to secondary authority to be able to go after somebody like Spotify. We can be confident that's not going to happen again?
Sir, we routinely conduct brand and safety reviews to make sure that these partners of ours are living to their standards. And in the case of Spotify, we didn't boycott anything, we didn't pull our spend. They continue to be a major media partner for us. We wanted to understand during a health crisis in America what Joe Rogan was talking about, and did it comply with Spotify's standards of service?
So one final issue in regards to this, is it, has GroupM done a mea culpa in regards to this information that was throttled in regards to the COVID disaster that happened, not just in the United States, but across the world? Has there been an acknowledgement by GroupM that many of the things that were talked about by people like Joe Rogan and others have actually turned out to be true, that they are not misinformation? Has GroupM acknowledged that?
Sir, I'm not aware that GroupM ever came out and said that Joe Rogan was spreading misinformation or that Spotify, the platform. We asked Spotify to clarify their policies. We are in the business of connecting brands and consumers in a way that their messages can be heard in an authentic manner.
So you weren't going after Spotify?
As I said, we never reduced our spend once. We didn't call for a boycott. We didn't. We asked for clarification from Spotify.
Mr. Patel, the VP for Facebook let us know a few years ago that they put out information telling people how to get into this country illegally, and we've seen over 10 million people do that here in less than 4 years under the Biden administration. Is your company, Unilever, does some advertising on Meta, I'm assuming?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Is a Trump ad, as was alluded to by my colleague from Florida, is that more dangerous, or is it more dangerous to have Facebook telling people how to get into our country illegally? You had some VPs that said that a Trump ad was very dangerous and that it should be pulled down. Is that more dangerous, a Trump advertisement for president, or is a Facebook saying that they are encouraging people to come into the country illegally? Which one's more dangerous?
So from a Unilever lens, we believe that's not the content we want our brands associated with.
Will you stop advertising with Meta? Because they have encouraged people to come in illegally. I mean, if you took an ad like that out in the newspaper, you'd be in big trouble. It seems like the same thing should happen to Meta. They're breaking the law, telling people to come into this, telling people how to come into this country illegally. Will you be dropping your advertising from them?
So that's why we work with GroupM and different partners to ensure our brands appear adjacent to the content that we're targeting for the audiences that we are.
But hasn't GroupM failed you then? They did not find out that they're actually encouraging illegal activity. Shouldn't GroupM be telling you that, hey, there's a problem here?
So that would be, we also have verification within our own organization to see where our assets are appearing. So it would be picked up in the system.
I wish I could do some more follow-ups, but I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you. Mr. Shapiro, thank you for joining us today. I think it is important that you're here as one of the leading conservative voices in the country. And the country has, in the last couple weeks, talked a lot about and Googled Project 2025. It's one of the most Googled search terms right now. And you're not going to get any censorship from me. So I just wanted to know, from your perspective, I think it would help us understand, on just like a scale of 0 to 100%, how much do you support Project 2025?
I think, like President Trump, I haven't looked all that deeply at Project 2025, but it seems that Democrats on this committee, sort of like Peter Pan and Tinkerbell, if they say Project 2025 enough, their presidential candidate becomes alive again.
And so, well, let's just talk about pieces of it, and I guess you can tell me if you support it. You probably want less bureaucracy, right?
I do.
I want less bureaucracy. You want more efficiency?
I do.
I want more efficiency. You want taxpayer money spent wisely?
I do. Congrats on becoming a Republican.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents would be proud. Mass deportations, it calls for that. Do you support that part?
I support the deportation of any illegal immigrant who's in the United States who is not of benefit to the generalized American public.
So if they're picking agriculture that puts food on the tables of everyday Americans, they've never committed a crime inside the United States they didn't come across with documents, should they be deported?
If they have not paid taxes and if their draw on the taxpayer benefits are larger than the contribution they are making to the economy, or if they're involved in criminal activity, they should be deported.
How do we measure that?
The same way that the IRS measures my income every year. It seems like if the IRS can track down every aspect of every receipt that I've ever submitted, and
So
they
if
can
they were
do so for
willing to
hundreds of
pay-
millions of other Americans, they can do that for illegal immigrants as well, except for the fact that no one knows how many are in the country thanks to this administration.
So you would be cool with creating a system where they could pay those taxes if they wanted to and then stay and work and put food on our table?
It depends on how long it would take for them to pay the taxes, and they would also have to go presumably to the back of the line, although I'm not sure why I'm testifying about immigration policy at this point.
How about banning the abortion pill? That's part of Project 2025. Do you support that part?
I think that that's a state-by-state issue on a personal level. I'm
just
fully
asking you.
Sure, I'm a fully pro-life person, which means that I'm not in favor of the distribution of the abortion pill.
Banning same-sex marriage. What about that part?
I am in favor of traditional marriage between a man and a woman, and I'm perfectly fine with anyone having any sort of voluntary sexual arrangement they seek. That's a different thing from whether the government should attach benefits to that personal relationship.
But you think it's a sin to have same-sex marriage?
I mean, I'm confused. Are you asking me as a religious Jew what I think about biblically?
I'm just asking, is it a sin to be gay?
Is it a sin to be gay? I mean, how long do we have here? 2 minutes? I mean, if the basic idea is that sexual orientation is up for government regulation, I'm not in favor of the government regulating the private consenting sexual activity of adults. That is a different thing, once again, from whether the government ought to engage in actual benefits for particular sexual arrangements that adults make.
But again, just you to me, is it a sin or not?
From a religious Jewish perspective, orientation is not a sin, but activity is. That's also the same perspective of most major religions, so far as I'm aware.
Okay. And how about cutting Social Security? Do you support that part of 2025?
I'm not sure what Project 2025's position on Social Security is. I'm in favor of the restructuring of Social Security along the lines of privatization and lowering and increasing the retirement age, because you, as well as every other congressperson, knows Social Security is going to go bankrupt, and yet everyone seems to have an interest in lying about it for the next decade and a half until we have to take austerity measures or radically increase inflation or taxes.
And bans against books about slavery. Do you support that part about?
Why would I possibly be in favor of bans about books about slavery? That would be absolutely ridiculous. What I am in favor of is the idea that school libraries should be able to make decisions along the lines of what exactly is appropriate for, say, a 7th grader and whether they ought to be treated to cartoons and genderqueer. That's not quite the same thing.
And just because we found some receipts, you did say, I think homosexual activity is a sin.
Yes, I'm a religious Jew, that's
sure
true.
There's a genetic component.
You found me out.
Orientation. But the view of all religious people I know has always been that sexual behavior is something that is up to you. And you said, I may have a desire to sleep with many women, but I do not.
I agree with me. Yes, that's true.
Congratulations on your, I'm sure it's very hard to restrain yourself. Mr. Chairman, I just want to shift to Alvin Bragg. He was supposed to be here this week, and he's not coming. And Hunter Biden was supposed to testify. Now he's not testifying. We were supposed to have votes on articles of impeachment, and we didn't. And again, we're just wondering, you guys write great press releases, but the payoff seems to never come. And so I guess we will keep waiting, and we'll do hearings like this. And finally, Chairman, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, and that's a restriction on speech, as you have recognized before. But you can yell theater in a crowded fire, and you all can continue to do that all you want, and we'll just waste the American people's time.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I remind him of the first rule of holes. When you're in one, stop digging. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Mr. Shapiro, we have heard a lot today from our colleagues across the aisle and your fellow witnesses about the need for brands to avoid placement against or association with controversial content. And the examples that we've heard cited are truly despicable. Child sex abuse materials, terror threats, foreign propaganda, promotion and funding of criminal activity. So just to be clear, you have had personal experience being targeted by these collusive activities and these limitations of advertising. So let's clarify the Daily Wire and its associated content. Do you include any child sex abuse materials on your website?
No, we certainly do not.
Do you promote terrorist activities or ISIS videos?
No, we certainly do not, unlike some members of the Democratic Party who seem to
Do
be
you promote
more
or
informed.
fundraise for criminal conduct?
We do not.
Do you share foreign propaganda?
We do not.
In fact, Mr. Shapiro, is it not true that the Daily Wire website, associated content, and social media involve none of those things and are instead a reflection of mainstream conservative ideas and thought?
That is correct.
I'd also like to discuss the concept of advertiser engagement and return on investment. Do you have any knowledge or information about the level of audience engagement with advertisers who do choose to advertise on your platforms?
Thank God we have extraordinary levels of advertiser engagement with our audiences, which is why we continue to maintain a significant ad presence despite the obstacles we've discussed today.
And if an advertiser were making a market-based decision, do you have a decision based on actual economic input and engagement with the content consumers? Do you have any information or opinion about whether that return on investment is a good one if they engage with the Daily Wire?
I'm obviously biased in this matter, but I obviously think it would be an excellent investment, and we have heard from certain advertisers that what they actually would like is some sort of cover and less public pressure on them so they can make market-based decisions.
Now, in your experience, you have actually had your own content limited or removed or censored, have you not?
We have.
Would you share with us some of the examples of content that you have had limited or censored?
Well, let's see. I had about 4,000 of them. Seriously, about 4,000 content enforcements across our various YouTube channels. We've actually had to engage in self-enforcement because the corresponding information that we're getting from social media is so poor. And so one of the things that we've had to do in the past is sort of prospectively remove material in the hopes that we will not be demonetized if we do so. Some of those matters have been, for example, describing the geography of the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Israel and Egypt in the Gaza Strip. That could get us demonetized. Any mention whatsoever of a man not being a woman, that will get you demonetized on YouTube, for example. And as I've mentioned, when you're demonetized, it's not merely that you're demonetized, that YouTube then has an interest in preventing the dissemination of your message. So the number of people who will actually see your particular video will be lower than if you are a monetized video. And we have example after example of this. I mentioned in my testimony that Matt Walsh, fellow host over at the Daily Wire, he was fully demonetized on YouTube for pointing out that men are not women, for example.
So is it correct to say, then, that the collusive activity by advertisers to choose to limit or choose to restrict utilizing your platforms, it has both a monetary impact and a potential impact on your ability to reach new subscribers and viewers?
That is certainly true.
Now, you touched earlier on the fact that you've obviously been able to transcend these types of barriers in your own business operation, but you touched earlier on the type of detrimental effect that this has on a new or startup company. Could you explain to us exactly how this type of conduct or this type of collusion can inhibit the ability of new companies to form or new thoughts or ideas to actually reach the American public?
Sure. So let's take a look at a startup conservative media company, and GARM decides to apply its misinformation standards, which are extraordinarily broad and subjectively defined to that conservative startup media company. They have to be extraordinarily careful of what they say to the extent that they may not report material that they think will be detrimental to them. And we've been demonetized in the past for even pointing out something that's now become patently obvious to the American people, the mental decline of the President of the United States. If you are a startup media outlet and you are focused in on something like that, the possibility that you will then be demonetized by a social media platform based on GARM removing its advertising, using its standards, telling its advertisers not to advertise on these particular platforms, that's going to deprive you of the advertising revenue necessary to actually build your operation, get new reporters, hire new opinion writers, and then do the actual marketing on your own that you would want in order to achieve market share.
And you go all over the world and give talks and engage with everyday citizens about the issues that are of interest and concern to them. In your opinion and experience, do those issues you just touched on, are they of interest to people about, and just in general, the political discourse and things they want to hear content about today?
They certainly are of interest. And I find it a mass puzzle as to why the advertising market, if there is no sort of at least informal collusion between them, have deprived the advertising revenue from literally half the American public.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Without, for what purposes,
Mr. Chairman, I need to speak to my colleague's comments about Professor Waller. He misrepresented and maligned the witness and falsely represented that
Is
the witness
there-
has something to
is there a
do with the
motion?
majority's
Or you
far-reaching investigation.
Point of
into
order,
the
Mr.
FTC.
Yeah.
GARM testified over a month ago on all these questions.
Gentlemen will
The majority
suspend.
could have invited them
The gentleman will,
to speak
the
at this hearing.
gentleman will
They did not.
suspend.
Finished.
The gentleman has a right to speak on his time, or if it's yielded on someone else's time. If there's no motion involved, the gentleman is not in order. Does the gentleman wish to pursue a point of order?
I withdraw, Mr. Chair.
The committee will now stand in recess for 5 minutes to give the witnesses and the members a break.
How are you? Committee will come to order. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when I was home in my district last week, I was not surprised to be approached by multiple constituents who were appalled by the radical decisions that had been issued recently by Mr. Trump's right-wing Supreme Court, particularly the U.S. versus Trump decision, which gutted the carefully constructed checks and balances on the presidency, which had been drafted by our founders to ensure that presidents would be held accountable for criminal activity and other dictatorial tendencies. I was more surprised at the number of constituents, and it was not small, who wanted to talk about the Trump court's decision to overrule the Chevron decision. I mean, administrative law is not usually the first thing that I get approached on, but at picnics and out in the community, at the grocery store, the checkout clerk wanted to know about the Chevron decision. And this is a doctrine that has required courts to defer to agencies with subject matter expertise when interpreting congressional statutes. Last month, the court said that unelected judges are not to defer to the agency experts and must substitute their own judgment when making those interpretations. And at the same time, the court removed time limits for challenging agency regulations. So as my concerned constituents realize, these decisions seriously destabilized and damaged our regulatory system. But after all, that is one of the chief objectives of the Trump transition plan, known as Project 2025, and it is wholly supported by the House's MAGA majority and the radical Trump court. But ordinary Americans are rightly concerned that these decisions have opened the door to attacks on regulations that have long kept us safe, that protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the medications we take, that prevent businesses from cheating customers, and that require employers to have safe workspaces. In addition to endangering American families, these decisions will introduce uncertainty into nearly every part of our economy. And over again, I hear from the businesses in my district, they want certainty. Businesses that have operated for decades in a stable, settled regulatory environment will now have to adjust to an unstable and ever-changing landscape. This will raise costs to businesses and will raise barriers to entry for new or small firms. In the wake of these radical decisions, Americans want to see their representatives discussing how to keep them safe. They want to see us supporting bills like the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which codifies the Chevron doctrine and strengthens the federal rulemaking process. This is what we should be discussing, not a podcaster's right to advertising revenue. But that's what judiciary Republicans want to spend our time and resources on. So we're here today to discuss whether conservative commentators and websites have the right to an ad deal. Private companies are allowed to choose where they want to advertise. That's the free market, which our MAGA Republican colleagues claim to revere, except when the free market rejects their deeply unpopular messages. We're here today because our MAGA colleagues and their right-wing nutjob allies cannot accept the fact that Americans and businesses are not buying what they're selling. Chaos, conspiracy theories, lies. Their websites are being rejected not because of censorship or antitrust violations, it's because their product stinks. They are the intellectual equivalent of an Edsel, maybe New Coke, or perhaps Trump water. If companies don't want their products advertised on a website that runs headlines like Disney's not-so-secret anti-white agenda, that's up to them. It's embarrassing to demand that government guarantee ad revenue to extremist websites. These deals aren't handouts, they're earned. This Congress committee Republicans have used a corrupt interpretation of the Sherman Act to call any business activity they don't like illegal collusion. We saw the same nonsense at last month's hearing on responsible investing, or ESG, which many investment companies had implemented in response to consumer demand. Go figure. But this is how House Judiciary Republicans have repeatedly wasted congressional time and taxpayer dollars with absurd conspiracy theories, ignoring the results of their hearings and then making wild claims. Mr. Waller, we hear a lot in this committee about weaponization. Can you speak to how antitrust law is being weaponized in this hearing for political purposes?
What I can talk about is I've written and published and expressed concern going back several years about the misuse of antitrust for political purposes. Antitrust, and I used examples from both the prior Democratic and prior Republican administrations. Antitrust works best to preserve a competitive marketplace, to stop the abuse of power by dominant firms, and prevent mergers that are likely to be harmful to consumers, labor, and other groups and suppliers. And that is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. That is just how the law's been for 130 years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your expertise. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shapiro, I was struck by another example of what you described earlier accurately as projection in Mr. Swalwell's comments. The Democrats today are expressing solicitude for and chastise the majority for chilling the sacred expressive rights of multinational conglomerates based in foreign capitals, but interrogate you about the intricacies of your religious beliefs on sexual morality. I apologize on his behalf. If it were genuine, I would sympathize with the objective of keeping famous brands out of controversy, that they stick to sports and entertainment. But the World Federation of Advertisers and their GARM that they've created, their members, they and their members continue to seek to involve themselves in highly controversial issues. Your colleague Michael Knowles in an article last year pointed out that InBev is a member of WFA. And the pretext for what we're talking about today is they want to keep their brands out of trouble, but they rolled out the Dylan Mulvaney campaign and destroyed the famous Bud Light brand. But they would tell us that the purpose of this organization, all these global conglomerates are members of, is to keep their brands out of trouble. Disney's a member of the WFA, according to Mr. Knowles' article. The report that the committee has issued discloses intense activity by GARM around Musk's purchase of Twitter. They didn't like that. Mr. Rakowitz, in a February 2023 email, joked to his colleagues about, quote, being the idiot who challenged Musk on brand safety issues. Since then, Twitter is 80% below revenue forecasts. And I think that email can be taken a couple of ways, but it sort of appears that he's actually patting himself on the back. He was called an idiot, but he's saying, I'm the genius that took Twitter down 80% of its revenues. But there's also, one of the things that they didn't like about Twitter was that they say Mr. Rakowitz also wrote that he had connected with members of GARM's steer team, these guys, about Mr. Musk's leadership of Twitter, and Unilever has, quote, issues with overly partisan takes, e.g. Hunter Biden laptop exposure. I think Mr. Tiffany was onto something earlier when he begged the question about interference in American elections. And the question I think I'd like to pose, I've heard a lot from my colleagues in the time I've been here about foreign malign influence. The Hunter Biden laptop suppression very arguably had a significant impact on the outcome of the 2020 election. So is this foreign malign influence? And what determines whether foreign influence from London, for example, is malign?
Again, I think that one of the big problems here that we have is vague, unspecified, subjective standards that are posing as pseudo-objective standards. And under that guise, all bias falls in one direction. When all the bias keeps falling in one direction, you start to suspect that actually the standard is not objective. And once again, the standards that are being used by GARM are as stated by the titular head of GARM. not aligned with the First Amendment. This is a person who is overtly criticized, according to the report, the First Amendment itself, talked about how those standards should not apply. So why wouldn't he apply his own standards or the standards of a political side of the aisle to advertising dollars if they could? I mean, the use, again, of advertising dollars as a cudgel in order to shut down one political side of the aisle, the effects of that are quite clear, certainly on a wide variety of businesses on the right.
So is it then, whether or not antitrust law as it currently exists extends to that, if foreign government or foreign-based political actors with global reach are using their economic power to limit the expressive rights of Americans, or certainly to intrude on and affect our electoral processes by favoring one political side or the other, to the point of, jumping in and saying we don't like the Hunter Biden laptop being exposed, is that not a legitimate object for Congress certainly to look at? And then should Congress consider the extent of its regulatory power to protect Americans' expressive rights?
I mean, it's certainly quite dangerous when you have the EU working with GARM to set standards for what companies can and cannot advertise or should not advertise, while simultaneously attempting to regulate the social media companies that are largely the recipients of those ad dollars.
What accounts for the solicitude of my colleagues, the Democrats, for the international conglomerates' expressive rights and their disregard for the expressive rights of ordinary Americans?
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy is rather glaring. As I said earlier, the shocking adherence to free market capitalism and freedom of consumer choice on the left side of the aisle today is something to behold. They've invoked it almost as commonly as they've invoked Project 2025 today, which, frankly, I'm getting a little creeped out by. I think if they say it 3 times, then President Trump appears and challenges them to a golf match or something. It's like Beetlejuice.
It would be funny if it weren't so strange. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank all of our guests for being here today. Professor Waller, I appreciate you being here and sharing your time and your expertise with us on these issues of antitrust. And I thank you for setting this committee straight when it comes to, as you put it, quote, the consensus of understanding of antitrust laws by most courts and commentators. It's critical that we combat misinformation faithfully and communicate the state of our law. It is also critical that we not lose sight of how the content underlying this hearing impacts businesses and people. Especially, my focus is children and other vulnerable groups as our lives move increasingly online. I want to read just briefly from the charter. It says, we are committed to taking actions which better protect everyone, children in particular, online, and working towards a media environment where hate speech, bullying, and disinformation is challenged, and taking steps to ensure personal data is protected and used responsibly when given. That's a pretty critical mission. I care about that for my kids and my grandkids as we are all moving more and more online. Professor, what does your professional experience tell us about GARM's objectives and the need to safeguard against the worst kinds of online content, child sex abuse material, terrorism-related content, and deliberate hate speech or misinformation?
What I've heard today, particularly from the witnesses from the companies, is a concern that an antitrust agency or an antitrust court would take very seriously as a legitimate business concern about how the standards for GARM assist a company in making a unilateral decision about the types of advertising that would best serve their marketing and brand management strategies. So I can't take it much past that, but I'm hearing something that a court or an agency would take seriously.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Patel and Mr. Jewell, maybe you could help me here. From your perspective, if businesses were required to place ads on certain platforms, what would that mean for your companies? And if you're comfortable speaking to this issue that I just pointed out I care deeply about, what do you think it would mean for child sexual abuse victims and survivors? Mr. Patel.
Firstly, what I would say is that telling us where to invest wouldn't be the best return investment for our brands and how to build the equity of our brands in the US would be the first response. We have a clear policy when it comes to where our brand agencies want. We don't want our brands to be near any harm. Like my testimony shared, there was examples of child abuse, etc., that brands like Dove should not be associated with and money invested against, quite frankly.
Can you give me an example of that? An ad placement?
Yeah, but I think 2 years ago, there was a Dove ad that was next to child abuse. We had a backlash, rightly so, from our Dove consumers to say, why would the brand be associated, an adjacency to that? And that's why we do what we do on brand safety.
I appreciate that. Mr. Jewell?
I believe the question was around if I was required to advertise on certain channels.
Correct.
What our impact be on that? That would be not great for our business, not great for free economy, not great for the brands that we represent that are trying to grow their own business. I mean, each brand and each product and service tries to connect with different audiences, and it's up to them. And some of the art of what we do, and honestly, the trillion-dollar media market that exists worldwide is about finding those audiences and how do you connect the brands with those people. To be forced into certain paths would sort of eliminate a free market.
Do you have internal conversations around the possibility that your ad dollars could be used unwittingly to fund child sexual abuse material? Do you worry about that? Do you have conversations about it? Because certainly it is a high risk.
Absolutely. We worry, and our clients worry. I spend most of my time talking to our clients about where their brand dollars show up and how they fund different types of content. And their number one concern is about providing assurances that they're not doing societal harm.
Mr. Patel?
Yeah, that's at the heart of the brand safety conversation.
Absolutely. And that's what we ought to be focused on here. How do we protect the online world that we are all now in, not just through the economy and through businesses such as yours, but how do we protect our children against this? That's where this committee ought to be working, not in the way we are today. Thank you all for your expertise. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for doing this hearing. It's actually a very, very serious issue. I have a personal experience, some of them I pose when I criticize failures of President Biden or President Zelensky or Jake Sullivan to deter Russia. Actually, we couldn't even post some of them, not just to get traction. It was kind of interesting. But so I'm sure that this is, very serious situation for a lot of people, and for freedom of speech, or freedom of opinion, and we're creating dictatorship of opinion, tyranny of opinion in our country. And I agree with Professor Waller, that's not a traditional collaboration of cartel. That's not a traditional cartel, too, because we actually have government coercing businesses and using mechanisms in businesses to restrain trade and take down competition. Very interesting. You actually, on the website of all of this organization, you talk it's first of its kind, cross-industry alliance. This is actually a flagship project of the World Economic Forum. We're creating public-private cooperation framework. We're actually creating this global risk, initiative and to control misinformation and disinformation, to shape the future of media, entertainment, and culture, and using organizations like SEC, FTC, PCAOB to take down competitors and businesses that don't agree with the dictatorship of opinion that we're creating. Actually, it's kind of interesting, I have to tell you, under Karl Marx and Hayek, communism, socialism, it's not redistribution of wealth. That's control of means of production, centralized power. And now we centralize in power in Washington, D.C. by controlling means of production, maybe not in the form, but in the essence, by using financial system, by using UN climate agenda and CSG, which is very vague disclosure, by using global organization to coerce CEOs and businesses to be able to intimidate, to sign on to something actually could be against the interest of their shareholders. This is very dangerous, what we have right now, creating the collusion of business and government. And what my question is, as an American congresswoman that have to protect American public interest and our investors, so I have a question for you, Mr. Shapiro. Don't you think, if these companies actually sign on to these initiatives of global agenda initiatives, that could be actually, this unusual collaboration could be actually harmful to shareholders because they can exclude, I think your organization, Daily, actually, this is your organization, Mr. Jewell, put Daily Wire on a global high-risk exclusion list, categorizes conspiracy theory interest in only conservative groups on that list. Kind of very, very interesting. But don't you think if we're going to include everyone who has a different views, like conservative views in our country, that's a risk that companies, publicly traded companies, should actually disclose. I think SEC need to tell them so American investors know, do they want to invest in all of these global initiatives and know that their pension funds are investing in these initiatives? Don't you think that is transparency that American public deserves and actually protect them because they might make your country, board-go company bankrupt because they now also colluded to take down boards using some illegal tools, but very interested in passive investment to become an active shareholder and against interests of the company. This is a pretty organized, very clever organized cartel. I agree. It never existed before. This is a very dangerous cartel to actually intimidate Americans and go after our First Amendment rights and freedom of speech and using money to do that. So I have, a little bit that minute remaining. So I would like Mr. Shapiro to tell me, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think American people deserve at least transparency so they know where the money are going?
That is my main concern. I think the lack of transparency is extraordinary, and the question that I would have for some of my colleagues on the panel is, can they name a single conservative outlet or conservative-leaning host that they would deem to be brand safe on behalf of their advertisers? A single one, and if so, could they name them?
Yeah, maybe that's something, Mr. Jewell, do you know who's a good, because you excluded a lot of conservative media, your company. So which are not in your risk profile?
There are 600,000 sites in that exclusion list, and the vast majority of those are made up of illegal content, IP infringement, and we work very hard to make sure that we understand who those are and how we protect our brands from infringing on that.
Well, do you have high level, with a lot of traction, liberal groups on that list? Give me some examples. Or because I only see conservative ones. So which ones? MSNBC actually part of is interested. NBC, it's part of your cartel. So that's a convenient way. You want them to be part of your cartel. So how does that work? To be not on the global exclusion.
The time the gentleman can respond. Time the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman wishes to respond. I think the question was directed to Mr. Jewell.
The exclusion list is public. We have access to it. There are sites on both sides of it that are represented.
Time the gentlelady has expired. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have lost count of the number of times we've convened this committee to advance tired, debunked, and wholly irresponsible right-wing talking points. But here we are again today. This morning, my Republican colleagues are upset that private companies that prefer to not have their ads monetize online disinformation or disturbing content have established a task force to address their concerns. According to my Republican colleagues, these efforts harm conservative media. But let's be clear, this hearing is about Republican concerns over continuous drops in ad revenue on social media sites like X, formerly Twitter, whose CEO has done his best to make the site accommodating to hate speech, disinformation, anti-Semitism, adult content, and other inappropriate material since buying Twitter in 2022. Concerned companies have paused advertising on the site or walked away from advertising on X altogether to preserve their brand safety and their brand's reputation. This has angered my Republican colleagues who do not want companies to have the freedom to make decisions in their own best interests. Apparently, they now hate the free market, which is an incredible turnaround. I have a question for Mr. Jewell and Mr. Patel. One anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that has proliferated in certain quarters of the internet is the so-called Great Replacement theory, which claims that Jewish people are orchestrating mass immigration in order to replace the white population. Can you explain why global brands would not want their advertisements to be associated with publications or individuals who promote the racist great replacement theory? Mr. Patel, I'll ask you first.
Well, first of all, we want to invest our marketing investment into the brands with the target audience that we go after. And that type of content wouldn't fit with what the brands stand for and what our consumers would expect from the brand.
Mr. Jewell?
As I said earlier, brands spend billions of dollars over decades building trust with consumers about the products and services that they bring to market. That's how they build their companies. That's what advertising does. If you then take that and put that next to content that is incredibly polarizing and divisive, think of the frame of mind of that consumer as they're looking at that. It's a bad association. We want to create good associations between products and services and the consumers. It's not about the content in terms of being conservative or progressive. It's about the nature of news and the divisiveness that exists right now. And so that's why overall news spend has come down to low single digits overall. It isn't about progressive or conservative. It's about the frame of mind and creating positive associations for our brands and our consumers so that they can have the productive conversations they want to have and continue the brand growth over time.
And wouldn't you say it's also about your bottom line?
Absolutely.
And what would happen if, you've heard the debate happening here on this dais all day. You've heard the questions from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. You can sort of see the intention and where they're trying to drive this conversation. They want to ensure that you are forced to do what they want you to do. What would that do to your brand and to your business and to your bottom line? Mr. Patel.
So firstly, ma'am, it would severely impact the brand equity and what the brand stands for. As we built these brands over decades and decades with substantial investment. Secondly, we would get a consumer backlash because they couldn't associate the brand with the content. And thirdly, the bottom line impact would be lost sales. And we're very proud to be serving 90% of American households today with our portfolio.
I appreciate it. I'm running out of time. I'll just say this. You've heard a couple of members mention Project 2025, and there have been some jokes made about it, and we've seen some of my colleagues try to run away from it. The whole point of our bringing this up to the American people, and as we've seen today, is that there is an effort by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to force their will upon the American public and American businesses, and it's terrifying. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes soon-to-be governor of North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't know we were going to talk Chevron deference. I didn't know we were going to talk consumer welfare standard and antitrust, which we have an entire FTC that has decided that is no longer the standard anymore. But I think sometimes when we talk about this stuff, it's when you live it and you do it. Mr. Shapiro, you're not asking Congress to force any particular advertiser to advertise on your show, are you?
No, I certainly am not.
And this isn't as simple. This debate and conversation we're having right now isn't as simple as an advertiser calling you and saying, hey, I'm not going to re-up my next contract because my ad revenue is not generating what we're doing.
That is normal course of business. It has happened from time to time.
Yeah, and it's not as simple as, we could talk Schrenk and Brandenburg and fire in a crowded theater, but one of the times you can yell fire in a crowded theater is if you see smoke. Like, that's truly what the decision means. There's an imminence requirement. I've been off judiciary for a while. I haven't got to give my speech on fire in a crowded theater is not actually the law, but from there. So we talk about demonetization. We do all of these things. Explain how it works. Like, you are a businessman. You provide content. You have over 1 million paid subscribers, I believe.
Yes.
You understand your demographics. You understand, that has a value add. So explain how this works and why it's a problem.
Okay, so the way that demonetization typically works is that we are notified by YouTube, for example, that programmatic ads will no longer be placed in the content on a particular video. We've also had videos that are taken down by YouTube for the same sorts of reasons, because they're trying to provide what GARM would call a brand-safe environment. And so they will censor those videos, or they will restrict the reach of those videos. So it's not just that we receive less revenue, it's also that the messages that are being disseminated in those videos see less audience. And this has become sort of a common practice. I mentioned earlier, we've had probably 4,000 content enforcements across our various YouTube channels based on some of the most innocuous statements that I've ever made, or that some of our other hosts have ever made. That demonetization is not just a matter of removing, prospective advertising dollar from the pockets of particular outlets. It is a matter of also shrinking the reach of particular accounts, such as to violate sort of censorship generally, those sorts of general standards.
And ultimately, what it does is it forces companies to make decisions as to whether or not they're going to change their content.
Oh, absolutely. We do that all the time. We literally, and not only that, but outlets like YouTube will actually attempt to demonetize or restrict your video if you mention that you're doing that. If you say, I can't talk about this issue on YouTube because I'm going to go talk about it over at Daily Wire, they will then demonetize the video for you mentioning that there's another place where they could receive that content.
And have you seen any metric in any of these, how all of this works that says this is, you talk about arbitrary
capricious,
rules.
yes.
Yeah, all of those different rules, but is there any evidence whatsoever that this is applied even-handedly at all?
I've seen extraordinarily little evidence that the sort of advertiser standards that GARM spells out have been applied to my friends on the other side of the aisle. And some of them are my friends, but people who oppose me or who oppose my agenda, I think that the proof is in the pudding. There have been zero questions about advertiser pullouts from MSNBC or CNN. Those questions are routinely asked with regard to people on the right side of the aisle. And I will once again ask, for advertisers, please name an outlet on the right side of the aisle that you would deem brand safe.
Well, that's my point. This isn't a particular advertiser choosing not to advertise on a particular show or a particular medium. This is widespread throughout the industry, which is eventually trying to create the content. And it would be easier to deal with this. We talk about misinformation and disinformation and all of that. But we have also been in these hearings where they were censoring malinformation, which is a brand new word, which is actually true information that isn't being used in what they deem the correct context.
That's correct.
And so we conflate the First Amendment and censorship and all of these different things at different times. But eventually where we have to end up here is in a space where there is the ability for people who have thought and have on the other side of the aisle to be able to participate in a marketplace in a way that is fundamentally fair. And I don't think advertisers are making these decisions based on where they're reaching the most customers.
I think that there's a lot of fear that goes into it, and I think there's been a bait and switch that's been played by some members of the Democratic Party in going after social media companies and threatening a different incentive structure, suggesting that if they put their ad dollars the wrong way or set their standards the wrong way, they are going to be regulated, they're going to be targeted, and then the minute that anybody says that that's happening, then the answer is you're not putting pressure on advertisers. How dare you invoke principles of free speech while attempting to tread upon it?
Yeah, and oftentimes they just hire former FBI agents to do the compliance in their own social media company. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like ask unanimous consent to introduce into the record a fake tweet sparked panic at Eli Lilly and may have cost Twitter millions. I have it right.
Without objection.
Thank you. And thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. I actually thought that Republicans were supposed to be proponents of the free market. But now I see I was mistaken because the majority of this committee appears intent on having independent companies run ads on their favorite conservative media platforms. And I hate to break it to my colleagues across the aisle, but companies' decisions not to advertise on conservative platforms, as we've heard today, is because they're concerned about being associated with the content on those platforms, and that content can hurt your brand and your revenue. And that's not an antitrust violation. That's the free market doing its work. It's also not an antitrust violation for these companies to be members of the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. They're not forced to do that. GARM is an organization that, as Professor Waller notes in his written testimony, does not appear to function as a trade association or even a traditional standard-setting body. Professor Waller also notes that GARM's members, for the most part, don't compete with each other. Rather, GARM's members are freely associating, a First Amendment right. It is explicitly protected by the First Amendment. So the majority and Mr. Shapiro allege that GARM is helping advertisers collude in violation of our competition laws. And I quote Mr. Shapiro, prevent anyone from disseminating information they don't pre-approve. However, GARM's members lack this kind of power. They're not gatekeepers for online information. And even if they did have this power, the revenue Mr. Shapiro's own company and popularity of his podcasts undermine this argument. However, even if there was collusion, which there is not, that could be protected by the First Amendment, by the right to association and the right to speak or not to speak. Isn't that right, Professor Waller? Because the Sherman Act was never intended to restrain First Amendment expressive actions like group boycotts. Is that correct?
Yes. The First Amendment in antitrust operates more as a shield rather than a sword. And companies are allowed to work together or individually to seek governmental action, to persuade the public on matters that are of concern to them.
And Professor Waller, even if it made sense to characterize GARM's conduct as a boycott, would that make any difference under the law?
No, you would have the same issues that we've talked about. There would have to be an agreement. There would be you'd have to have some substantial harm to competition, and in general, you would have to have a lack of a legitimate business justification.
Okay, so, and the courts have been consistent about this. Is there any kind of big split in the circuit, big controversy over this?
Not that I'm aware of. Over the last 60 years, there was a time where if you called something a boycott, it would be treated as per se. And over time, the courts have just backed off and said, we really, unless it's part of like enforcing a cartel, it's really a case-by-case basis where you balance the harm against the justifications involved.
And the situation with GARM and that's going on with advertising wouldn't even come close to meeting these antitrust standards?
In terms of the publicly available information, what I've heard today, no.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me be clear at the outset here, because I've heard some words on the other side that don't make sense. Nobody here, and we all know this, I shouldn't even have to say it, nobody here believes in advocating for child pornography, for violence, for glamorizing harm to others, for human rights. We are supportive. Nobody here is anti-Semitic. And for that matter, X is not accommodating hate speech or pornography. They just they let everything be heard, everything that's in the free marketplace of ideas. And we are proponents. We keep hearing, oh, you're not proponents of the free marketplace. The very reason we're here is because we are proponents of the free marketplace. The very problem that you have and what you do is you are stopping the free marketplace, not only of goods and services, but of ideas. That's what America is based on, a freedom of ideas. It doesn't matter if you're conservative, if you're progressive, if you're liberal. It doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're allowed to express yourself and let the consumer of those ideas or those products be the one to judge what they want to do. You know, the whole damn thing sounds like some kind of grand conspiracy theory. It's like a bad James Bond movie. I can't believe it. A global cartel, and this is what it really is, the plain words. It's a global cartel controlling what we see, the news we consume, and the posts that we engage with. And the power isn't that you tell them, no, you don't go to an individual business and say, no, you can't do this. And they know very well that's not what it is. It's the rating system. So businesses are busy being businesses. They look at a rating system, and if you get a low number, they figure you probably shouldn't advertise on there. It amazes me that conservative viewpoints get out there at all. It amazes me that this election is even close. It amazes me that people do have alternative ideas. Everybody have an iPhone? Almost everybody does. Do you ever go to Apple News on the iPhone? I do all the time, because I want to hear what they're saying. 90-some% of the time, it is obviously, blatantly left. We should hear both sides. That's what this is about. Unelected, unseen, it's undeniably a true threat to freedom. GARM wields tremendous power. It controls, and you know this already, 90% of global advertising, almost $1 trillion. We have concrete evidence, we're not making this stuff up, of GARM organizing boycotts like the one against Twitter because of Elon Musk's acquisition, which the left used to love Elon Musk because he's electric cars, he's all about it. Now they don't because he believes in individual freedom. They also pressured Spotify to penalize Joe Rogan for expressing views on COVID-19 vaccines, despite not having a direct brand concern. But it was your concern. It's your ideas. You want to change America. That's the truth. You want to change America as we know it. It's not protecting brands. It's silencing dissenting viewpoints. Internal documents reveal coordinated efforts to demonetize conservative news outlets, Fox News, Daily Wire, Breitbart, simply because they don't align with your ideas, because you want to change America. And this is blatant partisanship. It undermines the very foundation of our freedom of speech. It's everything what America is about, freedom. All those ideas on the marketplace, left, right, middle, everybody should hear everything. And you shouldn't rate them just on the basis of that. And we know in the up to the 2020 election, GARD members actively flagged and suppressed political ads from then President Trump as misinformation. There's so many questions, and I'm going to put them in for the record, but let me ask this. Mr. Shapiro, NewsGuard ranked leftist media organizations on average a 91, left organizations on a 0 to 100 scale, right-leaning organizations a 66. Can you name a few examples, and I know you can, of leftist news sites and newspapers who've published verifiably false stories, yet still receive a high grade from you all because you want to change America? Can you name some?
I mean, the list is extraordinarily long, obviously. CNN targeting the kids at Covington Catholic would be a perfectly obvious example in which they lost a massive lawsuit to one of those kids. The attempt to treat the White House's favorite talking point of cheap fakes with regard to the president's mental wellness as actual fact, which has been the sort of case for the last couple of weeks. That's leaving aside opinion hosts like Joy Reid, who routinely says things that are extraordinary, celebrating quote-unquote white tears. These sorts of things happen all the time on the left, but that has never amounted to a massive ding in the rating of, for example, MSNBC. Russian collusion, the idea that President Trump was himself some sort of Russian cat's paw, which was trotted out by the Democratic Party as well as the New York Times for literally years on end. And the list is endless, which is precisely why, if you look at the Gallup polls and levels of trust in media right now are at all-time lows. They were about 50% back in, say, 2005, and today they're south of 30%. There's a reason for that. They've blown out their credibility, but that doesn't seem to blow out their credibility with GARM or NewsGuard.
Because they want to change America. I yield back.
Time and gentlemen's expired. The gentleman from Vermont's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses. I know you're all busy people. Appreciate your time here today. What I've gleaned from the hearing so far is that companies set up Global Alliance for Responsible Media out of common sense, out of business sense, out of the bottom line decisions, and not essentially about ideology. And I suspect many big corporations would advertise on hard right websites if it made business sense. But it doesn't oftentimes make business sense, and that's why companies make a different decision, and some of my colleagues are having a very difficult time accepting that. In the real world, most people, and I talk to constituents a lot, are very skeptical of conspiracy theories. They do not want to be on divisive platforms generally. They tend to unplug from news media generally right now because of the partisanship. They shy away from hate speech. They don't want to be fully engaged day to day on divisive partisan politics. And it follows that people get a negative impression of brands that are associated with that content. This is my understanding from everything that I've heard here today. This is at the heart of what you're talking about in terms of brand safety. So we can't help that there are conservative corners of the web that are rife with hate speech and misogyny and, yes, some disinformation. And it's simply a fact that companies operating in the free market have to contend with that. They have to make decisions about the situation that they're confronted with. And as others have pointed out, I do think there is some hypocrisy at work here when my colleagues claim to care so passionately about the free market, except when it tilts away from decisions that companies are making against posting advertisement on particular platforms that they think are not helping their bottom line. So, Mr. Patel, thank you so much for your time today. Why did Unilever decide to join GARM? Can you just take us through that quickly?
Well, firstly, Unilever created the responsible framework in 2018 because there was a need to have safe content with social media platforms. Then in 2019, GARM was built from 12 advertisers, 6 multimedia sites, social platform sites and agencies. And that was because they needed some sort of structure to say, how would we define brand safety? And that's how the GARM was born. It was voluntary, and it's up to the social media houses to decide on what content is uploaded and not.
I appreciate that. And you said it was based in need. Can you just flesh out for us when you say the need? What was that need?
The need was for advertisers to make sure how would we have a safe place for our brands to be adjacent to content that we thought would be right for our consumers.
And so there are risks to brands. And could you just give us one example of what that looks like when a decision is being made about your product and where it's placed? How does that potentially risk your brand?
Well, an example would be, the Dove brand that's for 20 years has supported real beauty in the US would be next to content that would be harmful to shaming body shapes, which is not what the brand stands for.
And you mentioned that, I believe you said that 75% of your $850 million ad budget is directed towards women in particular.
Yeah.
And so does advertising on parts of the web that feature hate, prejudice, misogyny help you sell your products to women?
No.
Right? No.
No.
No. No. Because I can speak here as a member of this committee. I can also speak here as a woman. No. Right? And so we have lost the thread here on the common sense. And I think we have to cut through all of the posturing here. Why would you want your brand next to speech that potentially is discriminatory towards women if most of your market that you're trying to sell to is women? Mr. Jewell, in your testimony, you describe an apolitical, industry-wide preference to advertise on sports and entertainment sites instead of news. Briefly, can you explain once again why that is?
It's similar to what Mr. Patel just said. We want to avoid divisive conversations and places where you have poor brand association.
I really appreciate that. And in conclusion, I would just like to say this is something that we all should take to heart, that the divisive partisanship and the fear-mongering is not serving the nation. It's also not serving our economy. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. Mr. Patel, how much market share did you say you have in the United States? How many $1 million do you spend?
We spend $850 million. So.
Are any of those clients big pharma? Drug companies?
No, sir.
None at all?
We spend our advertising on conventional media channels.
But I mean, when you're buying ads, are you placing ads for big pharma, for pharmaceutical companies, or do you just?
No, sir.
Okay. Ben, I got a quick question for you. We've heard a lot today about some experiences with GARM and the way they've treated certain conservative medias, or at least what we appear to be a mistreatment of certain conservative medias. What about, how have those organizations like, say, Global Disinformation Index and NewsGuard, how have they impacted you as a business owner?
Well, GARM and other organizations like it have worked in conjunction with GDI and NewsGuard to set standards. And again, those standards are purportedly objective. In practice, they rarely are. And so NewsGuard, for example, has penalized us openly for being a conservative site. And when we mention that we are actually honest about our biases, what they say is, well, that means you're not objective, as opposed to other outlets which claim to be objective and actually are biased toward the left, for example. So when these standards are set, this is part of the problem that I would hope that Congress would help uncover. The lack of transparency in the standards is actually a weapon that's used against one side of the political aisle. And I keep asking the question over and over and over again, can NewsGuard name a major right-wing outlet or conservative outlet that it deems brand safe? Can GARM do the same? Because I certainly have seen no evidence that they have deemed, say, the New York Times or CNN brand unsafe in the same way that they would for conservative outlets.
So basically, you think liberal organizations are not being treated the same? I mean,
well, they're being whitelisted, and I think that, well, it's clear that it is true that the amount of money that's being spent in the ad market in news is declining. That does not mean that it is declining proportionately based on politics. That is not the case. A huge percentage of those ad dollars are still going to purportedly objective or left-wing outlets, and virtually none are going to right-wing outlets.
And in referencing Joe Rogan, he's been mentioned a couple times today, and I think when he said on his podcast that young males probably didn't need to vaccinate, I imagine that did impact a lot of the big pharma companies that do a lot of advertising. Do you see a scenario, and that's what I was trying to get at with Mr. Patel, do you see a scenario where the advertisers come to, say, a Spotify or whoever's buying bulk advertising for that certain group and say, hey, this guy may hurt our market share, and could y'all quieten his voice a little?
Again, I've only skimmed the report, but I believe there are explicit instances in the report in which GARM actually attempted to suppress particular messages on social media that were damaging to its product, meaning videos that, for example, criticized particular products, did a bad product review, and they suggested perhaps these videos were violative of GARM standards.
Mr. Jewell, I got a quick question here. One of your employees, John Montgomery, the Executive Vice President of Global Brand Safety, wrote a letter to the leader of GARM, Mr. Rakowitz, comparing the Daily Wire and Breitbart. He wrote, quote, as much as we hated their misguided opinion, as much as we hated their ideology and expletive, we couldn't really justify blocking them for the misguided opinions. What ideology of Daily Wire and Breitbart does your company hate exactly?
It's not an ideology that they're talking about, and John Montgomery no longer works at the company. Really what we're trying to do
is... He said we hated their ideology in the quote. So what do you think, if he wasn't talking about ideology, what did he mean exactly?
I think that's an individual viewpoint that he was espousing. It's not the firm's decision. It's not what GroupM's position is. And I can't speak for GARM directly.
So, Ben, do you think that Mr. Jewell's answering that correctly, that that's not their ideology, that's just one former employee's ideology?
I mean, that letter does use the first person plural, as in we, as opposed to I. So the idea that he was speaking solely on his own behalf, while also, I believe in that email, signing with his corporate title at the bottom of the email, it sort of beggars belief that this is non-representative of the generalized worldview of the company of which he was an employee and in which capacity he was speaking.
Ben, I got 15 seconds. What is hate speech?
This happens to be the biggest problem with the label hate speech, that it has no specific definition, and we've seen it weaponized by some people on the other side of the aisle today to sort of broadly cover everything from things that we would all agree are disgusting and terrible to things that are essentially mainstream worldviews, like, for example, the idea that biological men and biological women are separate categories. These have all been lumped together, and this is the danger in setting up what are purportedly objective, pseudo-objective standards that are far too broad and subjectively applied.
I love how one of the members of the committee a while ago said she is a woman. You know? All right, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find it interesting that earlier today, a congresswoman on the other side of the dais was justifying advertiser boycotts of Twitter or X based upon how unsavory the content is. I logged into X as she was speaking. It turns out she has 2 active accounts. And we have, I think, one of the most ideologically diverse committees in Congress here, and I haven't found anyone who isn't on the platform. I'll yield right now if there's anyone who isn't on the platform and you'd like to identify yourself, but President Biden is on X, AOC is on, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is on X, Gavin Newsom spends a ton of money advertising on X, and you would think that if there was any group that was going to be sensitive to these sort of, risk of being associated with content you disagree with, it would be elected officials, and yet we had essentially 0% of elected officials drop off of X, whereas we had 80% of advertisers pull back from X. So why is this? Well, the committee's report shows why it is. There was a organized, centralized mechanism for causing advertisers to leave the platform. We have an email where one member company to WFA executive says, based on your recommendations, we have stopped all paid advertisement on Twitter. And one of those executives later boasted of causing an 80% below revenue forecast result for Twitter. So, you've been brought in, Mr. Waller, by the minority to talk about how none of this raises any real antitrust concerns. But I think the issue is, and I think it's certainly a legitimate business interest to have brand-related concerns about where your content appears. But when you decide to withdraw from a platform, you have to balance that consideration against the loss of economic opportunity for reaching a particular consumer base. So just to ground it in a real-world example, Mr. Shapiro, how many people do you say access your platforms across all the different platforms you have?
Again, speaking on behalf of just my own YouTube channel, we had about 50 million unique viewers over the last 90 days or so.
Okay, and so let's take the example of a brand. We've heard many brands say ice cream. Presumably some of those 50 million like ice cream?
I would assume so, yes.
And so if you're an ice cream company, maybe you don't want to be associated with Daily Wire for whatever reason. Maybe you've cultivated a particular liberal image. But if you decide not to advertise on his platform, you have to weigh that brand-related consideration against the loss of the opportunity to reach those 50 million people. But maybe that decision becomes easier for you if you know that your competitors are also not going to be advertising to those 50 million people. Mr. Patel, you said that you took your advertisements off of X for a time. Did you consider at that time whether your competitors were going to do the same thing?
No, sir.
You had no consideration of that at all?
No, sir.
Well, it seems to me it's sort of inherent in this global association that now exists that assurance does exist to some degree. So, Mr. Waller, getting back to the antitrust issues, I'm looking at the FTC's own websites here. It says competitor restrictions on the amount or content of advertising that is truthful and not deceptive may be illegal if evidence shows the restrictions have anti-competitive effects and lack reasonable business justifications. They cite an order, actually, in a case involving the Arbiter Association that actually enjoined communications that regulated, restricted, impeded, declared unethical, interfere with, or advised against advertising or publishing. So with that in view, and in view of the fact that we have sort of this coordinating mechanism that exists, that's centralized, that reaches different types of competitors and different types of industries, and we've seen action where they act in concert to stop competing in a given segment, for example, the 15 billion people that Mr. Shapiro reaches, and this behavior perhaps redounds to the detriment of consumers looking at the traditional consumer welfare standard and antitrust law. For example, one of his listeners or readers might not learn about the latest ice cream flavor that's available and may go on eating the same old flavors. This is a consumer welfare consideration. So why is this not a legitimate subject for antitrust scrutiny?
That's a lot to unpack, and also I'm just here in my individual capacity, and I don't speak for, nor could I speak for the Federal Trade Commission. Companies are allowed, I'll take Mr. Patel at his word that when he makes an advertising decision, he may or may not take into account what his competitors are doing. But the mere fact that even if he did does not make that an antitrust violation. There's dozens of cases.
But if he was assured that there was an association that they were all part of that is providing consistent advice as to where they should and should not advertise, does that change it?
If he's making a truly independent decision, no, that would not change things from a point of view of antitrust law. Also, I wouldn't expect that Mr. Shapiro's many watchers and listeners would be unaware of ice cream options just because there are or not ads on that platform.
Well, that doesn't really matter. They'd be more aware of them if they're available on the platform that they're using. And so that's the consumer welfare question. And so would you at least agree with me that if you're a company that has brand-related concerns about a particular platform, it's a different calculus whether to continue advertising there if you know your competitors are also not going to continue to advertise there? It's a different calculus at that point, isn't it?
It may be, but the most important thing is whether it's an individual calculus or a concerted agreement.
All right, yield back, thanks.
It's hard to be an individual when it's 90% of the advertising spend. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot today about how large corporations, advertising agencies, and industry associations through GARM participated in boycotts and other coordinated actions to demonetize platforms, podcasts, and news outlets and other content deemed disfavored by GARM and its members. But I'm equally concerned by the insidious relationship between GARM's partners and the government censorship by CISA. What we've learned is that GARM's ad tech partner, Channel Factory, collaborated on a common lexicon for mis- and disinformation. Mr. Jewell, did GARM's ad tech partner collaborate on this lexicon?
I can't speak to that. I'm happy to speak to GroupM and what we do with our customers, but I can't speak to GARM's ad tech partners and third parties that they've solicited. It's an independent company.
Well, CISA utilized GARM ad tech partner Channel Factory to collaborate, and although GARM documents are unclear, what is clear is that the Channel Factory lexicon was developed in conjunction with CISA. We have Global Chief Strategy Officer of Channel Factory, Phil Cowdell, sharing the lexicon with Mr. Rakowitz and writing, "The industry will need a common lexicon and detailed definition in order to make progress as an industry." Attached is the lexicon we developed with CISA and DHS, which may provide a useful starting point. Are you aware that DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency helped to develop this lexicon?
No, I'm not.
Well, the lexicon detailed definitions that contribute to or cause mis- or disinformation. For example, cheap fakes or malicious doctored video where content is selectively edited is listed as a contributing force to the spread of mis- or disinformation. The methods by which these definitions can be abused, especially through GARM, is clear. The Biden-Harris administration, for example, has made claims that certain embarrassing videos of President Biden are so-called cheap fakes, which we now know, many of which are not, in fact, cheap fakes, but are, in fact, an unfortunate reality and a serious condition. So, Mr. Shapiro, do you have any concerns with CISA's collaboration with GARM and the impact that that has on censorship?
And this is where I think my chief concern lies, is in context, formal and informal, between government actors and groups like GARM and their third-party contractors to define standards that act as essentially a cutout for violations of free speech. If the government were to directly do this, it would clearly be illegal. If the government instead puts pressure on private companies to do it, then that should also traditionally be illegal.
Yep, absolutely, and we are seeing this collaboration come to light, and in fact, it being misused by this presidential administration to suppress or redirect to what they allege to be misinformation, when in fact it's an effort by the press to get to the truth. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield you the balance of my time.
Mr. Patel, Unilever ever advertised on the Daily Wire? Have you guys ever advertised there?
Not sure if we've ever advertised, and I don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Jewell, any of the companies you represent ever advertise on the Daily Wire?
Not that I know of, but if they wanted to, we would happily do it.
If they wanted to, but you don't know that any of them have. Yeah. Is it like I I think, what did he just say, 50 million viewers over the past 90 days? What did Mr. Nadler say at the front end? He said like 13 million followers that they have. I mean, there's a real audience there. What would you say your target group is, 18 to 48-year-old women, Mr. Patel?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Mr. Shapiro, you got any 18 to 48-year-old women who, of those 50 million people watching your stuff, or those 13 million followers, any of them 18 to 48-year-old women?
Again, according to our latest statistics, about 65% of my listeners are between ages 18 and 44, and about a quarter of them are women.
Yeah, so that's a pretty big number. I mean, you guys advertise, did any of the companies you represent, Mr. Jewell, advertise at, say, the Washington Post?
Yes.
Do you advertise on The View?
Yes.
Mr. Patel? Same question?
We tend to invest less than 1% on any news.
No, that wasn't the question. Do you advertise on The View? Do you advertise in Washington Post? Any left-leaning program or platforms out there? Do you advertise there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you do advertise there, but you got a huge market here you don't. I mean, that's sort of the point. Because someone earlier, the gentlelady from Vermont, said this is all about business sense. Really? Because it seems to me if you got a platform where 50 million people are going to YouTube to see Mr. Shapiro's videos, you got 13 million followers, that's a pretty good, and a bunch of them are women. Bunch of them are women.
Would the chair yield for a moment?
It's not my time, it was yielded to me by Mr. Klein, so in
Would
fact,
Mr. Klein yield for a moment?
if Mr. Klein was here, I'm sure he would. But he's not, so I will try to get time. I know Mr. Fry's going to give me some more time.
Seconds.
Oh, the gentleman has 10 seconds.
Thank you. There was an allegation that Garm and CISA were collaborating. That is untrue. There is no connection between Garm and CISA. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Okay. I think this is the point. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming.
This is an article that I'm reading from, and it states there's a group of people who control what you are allowed to see, the news you read, the videos you watch, the posts you engage with. You haven't heard of them, you don't know their names, but they determine through methods both direct and indirect whether you are allowed to be exposed to particular messages. Their decisions can bankrupt companies, silence voices, and fundamentally shift cultural norms. Who are these people and how do they do this? Well, it's the World Economic Forum, the World Federation of Advertisers, and the Global Alliance for Responsible Media that was created by them. I ask for unanimous consent to submit this article into the record. There's a couple of things that I believe need to be corrected. Mr. Waller, you indicated early in your testimony that these various companies do not compete with each other, but that is in fact untrue. Unilever competes with Procter & Gamble, for example, and there are many other examples where these companies in fact do compete against each other. So when they are conspiring or colluding with each other to actually cut off conservative media, I think that there are absolutely antitrust considerations. And your willingness to just simply disregard that evidence is rather laughable in light of the information that has been brought to light today. Mr. Patel, you stated that Unilever seeks to avoid despicable content. That was what you stated in your testimony. Do you consider conservative media or philosophy to be despicable content?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And is GARM engaged in a political boycott of conservative media sources?
GARM is not intended to represent Unilever and where it invests and where it doesn't
That wasn't
invest.
what my question was. My question was, is GARM engaged in a political boycott of conservative media sources?
I'm not able to answer that question.
Mr. Jewell, is GARM engaged in a political boycott of conservative media sources?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, so then the testimony that GARM's actions are protected activity is not relevant to today's hearings, and in fact, GARM's operations likely constitute antitrust violations. Mr. Shapiro, the Daily Wire covered the boycott of Bud Light, and in this instance, Bud Light supported social policies which did not align with the values of many Americans. The facts were presented to the consumers, and they used their options that were available to select a different brand, which did not offend their personal beliefs. This is different than when companies go into the shadows and use an organization such as GARM to organize a boycott to deprive consumers of the choice of where they get their news without the consumers ever even knowing that their choices are being limited. Wouldn't you agree?
I do.
It's a very different circumstance when consumers engage in a boycott than when companies conspire to engage in a boycott based upon the content or the philosophy of the news organization that they're boycotting. Is it appropriate for GARM or its members to get involved with content moderation? Mr. Shapiro?
I believe that it is not. Companies should be able to do much of this on their own.
Okay. In March of 2022, there was an email from GARM co-founder and initiative lead Rob Rakowitz. Mr. Patel, do you know Mr. Rakowitz?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Jewell, have you ever met Mr. Rakowitz?
No, I have not.
But you both are on the board for GARM, is that correct?
We're on the advisory
Yes.
board.
You're on the advisory board, but you've never met the gentleman who put this organization together?
We have in Unilever, we have a senior member that sits on the board.
Okay. So in his email, he talked about GARM's boycotting and strong-arming of Twitter because it opposed Elon Musk and his free speech principles, according to Mr. Rakowitz. He wrote that Unilever has, quote, issues with partisan takes such as the Hunter Biden laptop expose. Mr. Patel, was the the information about the Hunter Biden laptop, was that a partisan take?
No, that's not what GARM is designed to do, and Unilever should not be involved in that conversation.
Okay. Did your organization, did Unilever avoid advertising on any type of a website that attempted to expose the truth about the Hunter Biden laptop
No.
that you're aware of?
Unilever did, no.
But GARM did.
GARM doesn't represent Unilever.
But Unilever is a member of GARM.
Yeah, but GARM doesn't represent how we invest our money.
I'm out of time. No further questions. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York's recognized. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the portion of the GARM transcript showing that all GARM members make their decisions independently. Quote, it's a tough position for advertisers because we have to respect independence and freedom of companies. Every company needs to make their own policies, unquote. Mr. Chairman, if the majority wanted to ask about GARM's policies, they should have invited a witness from GARM who would have testified that all its members act independently. I yield back.
We invited the witnesses who are the steer team who direct how GARM operates, so that's why Mr. Patel and Mr. Jewell are here. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to you 2 minutes, sir.
Oh, I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I just want to go back to where we were. So, Mr. Patel, Unilever advertises in the Washington Post, on The View. Do you advertise on CNN?
Very limited, sir.
But you do?
So we're talking about 3 million of a 850 million budget.
Okay.
On news.
So 3 million, just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. I guess out of 850. Okay. Do you advertise on Fox, Breitbart, or the Daily Wire, just to be clear again?
We have a partnership with Fox at its total level.
What does that mean?
So Fox is one of our strategic partners for sports and everything else.
Okay. Do you advertise on Fox News?
No, sir.
Not on Fox News, okay. And do you advertise in Breitbart?
No, sir.
And do you advertise on the Daily Wire?
No, sir.
Mr. Jewell, same questions. Do you advertise on Fox News, Breitbart, or the Daily Wire? Not Fox Sports.
We have a large partnership with Fox News.
You do? Okay, some of your people do. Some of the clients you represent advertise there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we have an ongoing dialogue with Murdoch's and Fox on a regular basis.
What about Breitbart and Daily Wire?
They have not reached out to us directly to have a conversation.
Okay. Well, you'd welcome that. If Mr. Shapiro wanted to reach out to you, and
of course,
you'd welcome that. Okay, that's good to know, because the guy who you just fired, it sounds like Mr. Montgomery, said that they should be blocking Fox, blocking the Daily Wire, and blocking Breitbart. But now you want to reach out to him. That's good. Okay.
We're open to having dialogues with anybody. Again, GARM doesn't decide where the money spends. We don't decide where the money spends. Our clients decide. It's their budgets. They decide if that can help grow their audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to piggyback and pick up off on that, they make their own independent decisions, but you advise them. At least that was the case with Mr. Raskowitz. Is that correct?
Our primary business is advising our clients on where they can connect with audiences. That's
Correct. So, for instance, Mr. Raskowitz one-on-one can go to Unilever or Coca-Cola or somebody like that and talk about why it's reprehensible that Twitter does this, or that that things aren't taken down, and he can advise those particular clients on why it's important not to advertise on certain sites. Is that correct?
I can't really speak for what Mr. Roskowitz can and can't do. I'm going to assume he has to
can't
get out those
speak. You
conversations.
can't speak to that? Why can't you speak to that?
I don't know what Mr. Roskowitz does.
Well, let me ask you this. What sites, I think Mr. Shapiro laid out a pretty good question earlier. What conservative sites are considered brand safe, according to your metrics? Name me like 1, 2, 5.
Fox?
Fox News.
Sure.
Fox News online or TV?
Both.
Okay. What are any other sites?
I don't have the full definition of what you would consider conservative versus progressive. Like I said, there's 600,000 different sites that are listed in those, and the vast majority of those are illegal.
Right, they're public, so I would assume that you have access to that just as much as I do, correct?
Sure.
So sites like John Stossel's website, that's a mandatory exclude, PragerU, The Federalist, Town Hall, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Newsmax, Washington Examiner, One American News, TuckerCarlson.com, those are all on the mandatory exclusion list?
I'm not sure which sites are and are not on there, but we're happy to get back to you.
Well, I mean, I would assume that you didn't just wake up out of bed and pop up into a congressional hearing today, correct? You prepared for this?
Yes, sir.
And this was not part of your preparation for a hearing today in front of this committee to defend the actions of these entities and organizations? You never thought, and your team never thought to look at and examine what sites were considered okay and not?
We've looked at that, yes.
So you can't tell me today what sites, other than Fox News, what conservative sites are considered brand safe?
Not at this point, no.
What liberal sites have been put on your risky list?
I'm not aware of the specifics on the site, sir.
See, I just find that, I mean, this is deeply troubling, and this is why we have such a problem with it, with you and Unilever and everybody that's in here, is that you dance around this word salad that everything is okay. In the meantime, you have people like Mr. Raskowitz who call it reprehensible that a social media company won't take down what he deems harmful content. Do you see the problem here and why the American people are distrustful of entities like yours and others who decide what content is safe and not, and what content is problematic and not? It's the man behind the curtain. It's the Wizard of Oz. And you were right in the middle of that, and that's why people are distrustful of you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Appreciate that, Chairman. And appreciate all your times. I know it's been a couple hours since we've all been here. My point of focus is going to be directed at Mr. Patel. The example used during the course of the day is Dove soap. And so I had no plans on asking a question until I started really thinking about Dove soap. So my family has owned grocery stores since 1917. We have about 45,000 SKUs. It's a product I know really well. And growing up, my mom favored Dove soap. I don't think Dove soap has been in my house probably for over 15 years. We use Irish Spring now. And I was trying to think to myself, when is the last time I saw a Dove soap ad? Now, I am a conservative family, and I look at a lot of different outlets, whether it's online or whether it's TV or radio or everything you can imagine. I haven't heard a Dove soap ad in at least 10 to 15 or 20 years. So if I was responsible to my shareholders and I had to go there and I had to answer to them if I'm doing the best job possible, for your words, the protection of the brand, you're using these extreme examples of situations where the brand might be associated with a freak situation versus a normal family of kids. We never see a Dove soap ad, ever. Now, so let's look at a couple different things. In my family, I have a couple Democrats that are brothers, and I love them like I love everyone. My mom made a rule. In our grocery business, we love Democrats as much as Republicans because she's brought up the example of Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan was asked to go against Ronald Reagan. The big media said, you got to condemn Ronald Reagan for all the wrongs that he's doing. And Michael Jordan responded to, even Republicans buy tennis shoes. So Mr. Patel, even Republicans buy Dove soap. So how do we sit here over hours and hours of testimony? How do you go to these shareholders of the Dove Soap Company and explain to them that we left out half of the population of America that doesn't deserve to see an ad to tell you how delightful Dove soap could be in your life? Your response, my friend.
Firstly, sir, it's disappointing that you haven't bought soap for 15 years.
Dove soap.
Dove soap, I would like to address that at some point.
Irish Spring's pretty good.
But what I would share is that, Dove as a brand has over 62% penetration in the US. So that's, agnostic of any conservative or liberal perspective. We advertise close to nearly 150 million on Dove. So it's not a lack of advertising on the Dove brand. And we make it very specific who we target, which is 18 to 49-year-old women.
I appreciate that. I will change my point of focus over to Mr. Shapiro and any response to that type of a question.
Would the gentleman yield for a second?
I will.
Thank you. Irish Spring is owned by Colgate-Palmolive. Colgate-Palmolive is a member of GARM. Thank you.
In response to that, being in the grocery aisles every day, the Irish Spring colorful box actually pops out and sells itself. And I wish there were some Dove advertisements to remind me how wonderful my life would be with Dove soap. So with that point of focus, we'll move back to Mr. Shapiro.
The soap battles were amusing. I was enjoying that, actually. As far as the generalized point that you're making, which is that half of the audience of the United States is largely being ignored by certain advertisers, that obviously is true. That doesn't mean that conservatives don't watch sports or don't watch entertainment. That is where presumably they're getting their exposure to Dove soap. But when it comes to the original question that the chairman was asking, which is whether, for example, Unilever advertises with the New York Times, or with MSNBC, or with CNN, or with The View, all of which have hosts who have said extraordinarily controversial things, the answer was yes. And when it comes to would they advertise or have they advertised on conservative news outlets, the answer typically is no. I also should mention at this point that I've been told by the advertising department of my own company that GroupM's managing director actually told us explicitly that Daily Wire has an uphill battle based on our politically conservative content. So again, the idea that that philosophy and ideology never take part in this.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield? Mr. Rulli, the gentleman yield?
I will.
I just want to clarify that. So just a few minutes ago, Mr. Jewell said if you reached out to them, they'd be willing to talk and consider advertising. That actually happened?
I've been told by, again, the people who, we have our own advertising department that deals with advertisers,
sure.
Obviously, and they did tell us that they'd spoken with the GroupM managing director who said that we would have a tough time breaking into their market specifically because of our political orientation.
So Mr. Jewell doesn't, what he said under oath here doesn't
I mean, they may have talked to Mr. Jewell, to be fair.
I understand that. I'm not saying that, Mr. Jewell, but that doesn't comport with what happened when Daily Wire talked to GroupM.
That's what I've been told by them.
That's interesting. I yield back to the gentleman.
I yield my time back.
And I should point out, Mr. Rulli's a grocery store owner, so there's a little something about putting things in the aisle. Does the ranking member have any closing comments? All right, gentlemen, we want to thank you for being here. I know
Yes, I do.
Okay, then the gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we've heard a lot of talk today about GARM allegedly taking down a Trump 2020 campaign ad. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the full email exchange related to that ad, which shows that Facebook did not take down the ad and said, quote, while some may find the ad objectionable, it doesn't violate any of these stated advertising policies, unquote.
Without objection. If I could, real quick. Mr. Jewell, you said you'd be happy to work with the Daily Wire if they reach out to you. I don't know anything about how the advertising world works. Is that how it normally happens? Do they reach out to you and say, hey, we'd like you guys to advertise here? Or do you say, wow, this is a platform with 15 million followers, 50 million views on YouTube. That's some place we want to go as a potential to make our clients money. How does it work normally?
Generally, publishers come to us and say, this is the audiences that we have, this is the type of content we have, would this be appropriate?
So it's that way. So it's from Daily Wire to you?
Yes.
Okay. And then just to be clear, that happened?
Apparently, but neither of us knew it.
Yeah, that happened, and your people told his people, GroupM people told the Daily Wire people, sorry, it ain't gonna work. You guys are too darn conservative, which is the whole point of today's hearing.
I can only go on what Mr. Shapiro said.
I can only go on that too, but he hadn't told us anything.
Well, what he said was
today
uphill battle, I think, not that it won't work.
Well, okay, then I'll change. It's an uphill battle, right? But it's not an uphill battle to get it on The View, The Washington Post, and CNN and everything else. And that is the point. That is the point. We want to thank you all for being here. And I got to read something here. That concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days submitted